Hey friends, and welcome back to Post-Mormon Parenting. A little while back, I had a Zoom call with my best friend from high school. Her name is Ilana. We grew up on the East Coast, so our high school experience was a little bit different than the typical Utah Mormon experience. And it was so fun to catch up with her and ask lots of questions about her experience growing up Jewish, what it was like for her parents, her family, and what that's like going forward for her raising her kid now. And it was fun to reminisce about high school together and share some memories. So I hope this is fun and educational and informative and entertaining for you. Enjoy! So we've been talking a little bit about your dad. Can you tell us a little bit about like how he grew up and the role of religion in his home and what that was like for him growing up, and then how that translated to like how he raised you?
First of all, disclaimer, I can't speak to anybody's Jewish experience except my own.
Right.
It's sort of like everybody has their own individual experience. And I almost just want to start with like my dad's parents, who came from Poland as adults in like the late 20s, 30s. I'd have to go back and check the year. That definitely influenced how my dad was raised, which in turn sort of influenced how I was raised. So when you called somebody Orthodox back then, maybe when my dad was growing up in the late 40s and the 50s, it was just a little bit more, I don't know the word to describe it. I don't want to say big tent, maybe I want to say for Orthodoxy, or more general. I don't know if that's the right way to really describe it. But basically, for example, you could totally be Orthodox and send your kids to public school. So Orthodox, my dad was raised Orthodox in the sense that his parents kept all of the laws of kashrut, like all of the kosher rules, and they had 4 sets of dishes, like milk and meat for sort of every day, and then also milk and meat, like kosher for Passover. So they would only use those during Passover, and they would strictly.
I'm gonna pause right there. So just for some of my my viewers who don't know, so keeping kosher, you don't mix meat and dairy in the same meal. Like, about how long is it before like that you wait before having one or the other?
Okay, well,
Like
which
2
sect
hours?
of Judaism?
Oh,
it depends. It depends.
okay.
Some people wait 1, some people wait 2 hours, some people wait 6 hours.
Oh goodness. So anyway,
Yeah.
so you have to have like different dishes for them as well. And in some households, they have different dishwashers, different sinks, you know, for handling. You just don't mix them. So anyway, thank you. Continue.
Yeah, and they kept the Sabbath, which means you don't, build fires, which means like don't use electronics, don't drive, and you don't work. Of course, that's the main thing you don't do. You don't work, you don't earn money on the Sabbath, which on the Jewish calendar is Friday sunset to Saturday sunset. Mm-hmm. So they kept that strictly. So until my dad was 18, he was following these guidelines. The main things you have to follow if you're Orthodox are, of course, believe in everything and do all the daily prayers, and also keep kosher and keep the Sabbath, of course, observe all the other holidays. And interestingly, he went to public school, which wasn't considered any type of big deal or deal breaker towards being Orthodox back then in like the late 40s and 50s when my dad was growing up. But he definitely went to like yeshiva. He definitely studied the Torah like outside of school, especially because his grandfather, who he was very close to, was a rabbi and helped him study. And my parents had like totally strict Orthodox wedding with all the traditions, including like, there's a tradition in the Orthodox synagogue, the men sit like in the main section, and the women, are sort of up in the balcony behind a curtain so that the men couldn't see them. But still today in Orthodox synagogues, they have that. So the men are sort of in the synagogue right in front of the stage, and the women are either in the back. There's it's called like a separator, a mechitza. It's some kind of like maybe like a wooden folding thing or like a curtain. Sometimes it's like in the balcony above, like at my parents' wedding, and sometimes it's just in the back of the room if it's like a smaller synagogue. And so Orthodoxy, still has that today, but there's all different things. So my mom was raised like completely Jewish by heritage, but basically it's a little bit like secular Jewish New York kind of thing, where it's just like, of course we don't eat pork at home. Pork's not kosher. Mm-hmm. We would never cook pork. Now, if you get pork fried rice in a restaurant, that's fine. that's fine for some reason.
Oh,
So
okay.
it's like a cultural thing where it's like, well, basically it's like, well, we don't even know how to cook pork. So like, that's why we're not eating it at home, essentially.
Yeah.
So basically
Gotcha.
almost like my mom was just barely religious at all. They had a Hanukkah bush around Christmas time, like that. So somehow my parents melded their two things together. And we went back and forth between like Reform and conservative synagogues when I was a kid. And then my parents tapered off with that when I was about 9, and I didn't have a bat mitzvah, which it's kind of interesting because ironically, like Orthodox girls don't read the Torah or read from the Torah because that's for men in Orthodoxy. So it's interesting, like if my dad had continued, the Orthodox path, like I would not have had a bat mitzvah in the sense of, I would have had a bat mitzvah in the sense of turning the age of becoming an adult, but I wouldn't have had a bat mitzvah. Like normally when we just talk about it, like in American culture, you kind of picture like a young teen or preteen, like going up and reading from the Torah, which they don't do in the Orthodox tradition. They do other things, like maybe they may present something that they wrote in front of a group of also women, like so present something in a women-only setting, maybe something that they wrote about an interpretation of part of the Torah or some other type of reading, interpret another spiritual text.
That's really cool. So for a girl, it would be a bat mitzvah, and a boy would be bar mitzvah. Is that correct?
Right.
Okay.
Yes.
And for a girl, you say it would be like an all women kind of thing?
Well, so, okay,
Depending
just totally
sex,
depends
probably,
what sect. So when I was growing up, we went sort of back and forth between the Reform and egalitarian conservative synagogue. So one thing about the why can't I speak today? Egalitarian conservative synagogue was the men and the women sat mixed together, as opposed to maybe, in the Orthodox synagogue, it depends sort of how strict they are. So maybe in the Orthodox, but not as strict Orthodox, men would be on the left and women would be on the right side and there'd be some kind of something between them, a curtain, a folding, what are those called? Those folding screens?
Okay, quick question. Sorry to interject again.
Sure.
But please. I'm just dying to know. So for the different sects and different kinds of like orthodoxy and egalitarian and conservative and reform, is there a lot of like bad feelings between people that practice in different ways? Or is it just like, everyone just does their own thing and whatever works for them and they get along? Or is it more like you're doing it wrong? I
have so many memes, Rachel, that I need to send you from my Jewish Facebook groups about this topic. Of course, everybody thinks the tiny differences that their neighbors do are funny and silly and ridiculous and need to be made fun of. A lot of it is just sort of all good fun. And there's even sayings, even among people who are pretty strictly Orthodox, there's a little bit of a joke. Everybody to the left of me is a heretic and everybody to the right of me is a fanatic, like just kind of jokes like that. Mm-hmm. So sometimes it's not just like, oh, you're wrong, but sometimes it's just like, look, this person's country of origin is a different country of origin from my parents, and that's just their different tradition. And then sometimes it's just, no, you're wrong. Like I think sometimes there is kind of a feeling of like, no, your interpretation is like definitely wrong in this thing. I would hope it's mostly in kind of good spirits. I mean, there's so few Jewish people in the world. We're only 1/5 of 1% of the world's population. Mm-hmm. And to just kind of have these, head-to-head battles, especially if it's just something that it's a little bit like, in my opinion, it's kind of live and let live. Yeah. Like what a woman is or is not wearing on her head. It's like, as my mom would have said, just be a good person. Like, just be nice to people. Like, don't fight over like what you wear on your head, like things like that.
What a good mom. What a good role model.
Where I hope it's just like people have just a difference of opinion. I think most reasonable people will be like, look, this is a difference in tradition or a difference of interpretation but yeah, then of course, sometimes there's just kind of a little like, no, you're wrong. No, you're wrong. But, what religion doesn't have that? I don't know.
I think about that too. When I think about, how even among like different families in Mormonism, some people can be more strict about Sabbath observance, and other people are like, whatever, we'll watch TV, we'll watch whatever we want, maybe we'll go run some errands if we have to. So you get the little bit of a difference.
When I was growing up, I remember, I faithfully believed in God, and I remember being really put off by people who I felt like they were following the rules sometimes almost to impress their neighbors rather than
Mm-hmm.
impress, you know, the big guy upstairs. We say Hashem, the name in Judaism, out of respect to not take, the Lord's name in vain. So for example, if you're on a long drive and you have to stop to grab a bottle of water or go to the bathroom, there's not a rule against buying a bottle of water or going to the bathroom at McDonald's.
Mm-hmm.
But because mostly they have unkosher food, maybe you don't want to be seen going in and out of there. People kind of use as an example of a rule. It's like, well, you shouldn't stop at McDonald's because what if somebody sees you and then thinks you're not kosher anymore, and it gives them mental permission to not be kosher anymore, and then you've caused them to, and I'm like, you know what? But if you know that you just stop, oh my gosh, and especially now that I have kids, if my daughter was like, I have to go now, I'm just going to stop in the first place.
And let other people just be responsible for themselves.
Right, and just to try to do things for the neighbors, I've never liked that, this little bit of performative, I want to show how pious I am. Sometimes it does kind of break my heart a little bit to see people do it for the neighbors, because I remember especially when I was young and I was like a very strong believer, I'd be like, but Hashem knows you were just going to the bathroom and that's not against the rules. It's not unkosher. So things like that. I don't even know if that's the best example of that, but.
That makes perfect sense to me. And again, like I can relate so much. There are so many performative actions that are available to us as Mormons, right? There's so many different ways that you can show just how pious and righteous you are, and just what a good example you're being to other people. You're letting your light shine, and they're going to see your example and be emboldened by it and be more righteous themselves too. And then too, I mean, there's the social pressure of conforming to the norm. Right. And if the norm is inching higher and higher, like you said earlier, I have a fence around a fence. That's how righteous I am. That's how committed I am to keeping all these rules. And I think we see that a lot, especially in places where people have Mormonism stretching back in generations, right, in their family, right? Like they can trace it all the way back to their like pioneer stock, right? And because it's so ingrained in their family culture too, I feel like you get even more of that like orthoprax, orthodoxy belief and practices that, you don't necessarily see in other places. Growing up on the East Coast, like I feel like my experience was very different from the experience of, especially the women around me. I feel like we have way more sexism built into the culture in more densely Mormon populated areas, especially that have been around for generations and generations. Whereas like on the East Coast, I mean, like I had very feminist church leaders, and I just thought, oh, that's just the way it is, everywhere. But anyway, back to your story and your upbringing, what that was like for you.
I guess I sort of sidestepped. I was the third child, so my parents were just a little bit like, does she need to go to Sunday school every Sunday? My parents were a little bit like, she missed last week. Maybe she can miss next week. I don't know. Like, I think I was going at that point to the, when I was the oldest point before my parents stopped sending me, that was at the like egalitarian conservative, and they didn't push the modesty stuff too hard, but I'd hang out with like a mix of different people. So I was hearing about different rules. And I kind of had to find everything for myself. Interestingly, so if I thought something was not modest, I wouldn't wear it to school. I wouldn't try to push the dress code. I wouldn't.
Oh, that's so cool.
But
sorry, I'm just imagining
thinking.
That's so cool that you would get to like, I see how my different relatives practice, and I see how my parents aren't pressuring me into orthodoxy. So I get to pick and choose and be intentional and deliberate about this and think about Hashem, right? And be a good person. And the things that I do, is that reflective of me wanting to be a good person. That, I think that is really, really cool. And I wish I had had a little bit of that myself, because growing up Mormon, it's like, no, you're told exactly how you can prove your worthiness to God. And how to be a light and an example to other people. You don't get to choose really a lot. There are like measurable ways to see, like, are you measuring up? And it's just terrible. So I love that was your experience.
Yeah. So in a way it was good, and in a way it was just like, on some level, I might have liked to have somebody just been like, look, you're fine. Because I would find myself sometimes agonizing. So everything's kind of, I be like, should I wear this? Should I not wear this? Sometimes it was a tough choice. Also, can I just say, having known you in high school, can I tell you sometimes that you were kind of like inspiring to me? Is that going to be like
What?
weird?
Oh my gosh. Oh,
Let me put it this way. I don't know if you remember this at all. I don't know if you remember any of these examples I'm about to give you.
okay.
But like, I remember we were in the same sex ed class. It was maybe junior year. I don't remember the exact year.
Yeah, I remember that class. Who can forget their sex ed classroom, especially when you're raised in like an abstinence only household. You know, I assume that was your household. I don't know. Anyway.
Continue. Oh my gosh! Sorry. Of course. Right? My parents always. They were just like, waited till we were married. I'm like, okay, you were 19 and 21, but good for you.
You waited so long, yeah. I was 20 when I got married, by the way.
Nice. I'm sure it was hard. I'm sorry. I don't mean to dismiss that it was hard to. I'm sure it was like hard to wait for my parents. I don't want to dismiss that, but they were just like, basically, I was definitely taught that sex was something for marriage. Like definitely. So also they really wanted me to have grandkids because even though I have 2 older siblings, they didn't have grandkids. So they were in high school. They were like, get married and give us grandkids. Definitely get married first. Like definitely get married first. So I remember in sex ed class, it was like the day when they were going to demonstrate. I can't even say it. I'm an adult with a child and I've been married for 7 years. I can't say the sentence. I demonstrated like putting a banana on a condom. No, wait, backwards. A condom on a banana. I already told you before we started recording, I was tired. Wouldn't that be funny? If they put a banana on a condom, they'd be like, this is completely wrong.
This is how you do it, kids.
How you do that.
Now you're educated. Go forth and prosper.
You said something like, you stood up in front of the classroom and the teacher didn't say like anybody who wants to opt out of this can. I don't think the teacher said anything like that. I think you just stood up and I thought it was
I think she did.
Oh, she did?
Thanks.
Okay. I think you were the only person who left. Okay, maybe she did. Sorry, I'm misremembering because it was like a million years ago. But I think you were the only person who got up. And you were like, Ilana, you can come with me if you don't want to hear this. And I didn't feel like if you hadn't had said that, I would not have felt like I had a real choice. Like I wouldn't have been brave enough to be the only one to stand up. Do you know what I'm saying?
That's so sweet.
So I ended up thinking, I actually thought about it and I sat and I thought about it. I don't remember how many seconds it was. I was like, no, thank you. I'll stay. And you were good. I said something like, are you sure? I was like, yes, thank you. And so I think you left the room by yourself, but it meant a lot to me because if I was able to stand out there with my friend and had my friend sort of, you know what I mean? Be like, you can join me or you can stay here. Like that actually meant a lot to me, like to have a real choice. Because honestly, like I remember reading books in middle school. I was very innocent. Books in middle school and high school that were like very graphic with certain sexual things. And it did make me uncomfortable. Like I was too young. I personally was too young. My blushing eyes, like I was too young to read some of this stuff, especially some like stuff we read in middle school. Like what was up with some of that stuff we read in 7th grade? You didn't go to the same middle school as me. We're reading They Cage the Animals at Night and like really intense stuff. Anyways, to see you standing up for your convictions, I have remembered that in my life, even if I didn't always precisely agree about how bad it was to curse. Sorry, Rachel, I curse a lot when I do stand up. You probably don't care anymore, right?
Yeah.
Like, okay, so remind me to send you some stand-up sets from the past 10 years. Sometimes just seeing somebody kind of, they believe in themselves. Like they know that they're standing up for something right. To just that power of conviction, it did mean a lot to me. And also, I was trying to think of another time when I thought it was cool. Oh, I remember we were talking about that Shakira song. I guess I'm going to like kind of reveal our ages by saying we were talking about a song that was totally not new at the time. No, sorry, not Shakira. It was Avril Levine. Sorry. It was Avril Levine. And it was Skater Boy. Do you know what I'm talking about? Do you know what?
He was a skater boy. She said, see you later, boy.
But do you remember what we were discussing
backstage
about
after the show? No.
About how at the end, when she was looking down, like he was looking down at his ex-girlfriend who had a baby or something. And you were just like, there's nothing wrong with having a baby. How dare they try to like put her down by saying, do you not remember this?
No.
Because you were like, wait, what's wrong with having a baby? And then I think somebody else was just like, well, maybe like it was out of wedlock or something. And then I think you were like, you were like, well, I think they were probably married. Or like you said something like that. Like, well, so of course she was got married because she had a baby. Like,
of course they would be married. If they had a baby, of course they'd be married. Like,
Who
So
doesn't do that?
I feel so weird for like telling somebody about this stuff. I'm like, remember? And the person's like, no. I'm like, this is weird. This is not fan fiction about your life. I swear I'm not making this up. This happened.
I totally believe you. 100%. Oh my gosh, that is hilarious.
But you know, I thought it like stuck with me that somebody, like nobody else in high school is just like, it's okay to have a baby. And we watched Mona Lisa smile too. I remember you're just like, why was everybody hating on that girl who wanted to start a family? There's nothing wrong with starting a family, but these things would resonate in my brain later when people would just be like, so when are you going to stop babysitting and go back to work after I had my daughter? And I'd be like, to have had people in my life be like, there's nothing wrong with having a baby. There's nothing wrong with having a family. That is kind of, it is something that sort of stuck with me. That's like, everybody has different opinions. I mean, my mom also was very big into like, everybody has different beliefs. Learn what you can from everybody else's beliefs. That's why my parents didn't freak out when I sometimes went to church with you, by the way. They were like, you're going to learn about different beliefs. Judaism's still right. Don't
Your
not be
parents
Jewish.
are so cool.
But, you know, they would have been probably really upset if I had converted to something else. But they were cool with me going to church with my friends.
I do remember you coming sometimes, but was it just church activities or was it like a worship service? I don't remember taking anyone to a worship service.
I think definitely one time at least. It was definitely, I remember sitting in church once because I remember thinking this is long, but I remember you being like, no, there's a basketball game right after this. And I'm just like, I didn't know we'd have to sit through a service first, you know, but that was like only one time. And then a few other times it was just like activities.
I bet it was. That's so funny. We wouldn't have done a basketball game on a Sunday. So it would have, it probably was like another activity, but with like a lesson first and then a game after.
It could have been
probably.
Yeah, it could have been like a mixer for like teens, like just teens hanging out and talking or something.
Yeah, probably.
It was a long time ago. But we definitely did basketball once. I remember because I'm bad at basketball and I was embarrassed because I didn't know anybody and I was bad at basketball. Great mix. I mean, I knew you because you brought me, but
you're so brave. You are so brave for coming to something like that. I don't think I would have done the same thing. You're totally so brave. Well, thank you for sharing those memories. That's really cool. I mean, now I feel like, everybody should really have a good sex education. Like abstinence only education is not good. That's not okay. I probably should have sat in on that class, but I like that you were able to like feel emboldened to be like, I get to choose what I want to do and I get to stand up and leave if I don't agree with what's happening or whatever. Just the ability to make that choice. I think that's cool.
Like you're sitting there being like, oh my gosh, was I being so judgmental? People must not like me. I never thought you were judgmental. On the contrary, like
thank goodness.
Like I thought you were like the nicest person and like sweet, like so sweet and accepting. So it's just kind of like, you know, sometimes you don't know how you are from anybody else's other, point of view, like.
So true. Well, and our memory is such a tricky thing, how it's not like a tape replay. I used to think it was like that it was like replaying a tape in your head.
Right.
But now I know it's more like, no, our brains are trying to reconstruct what happened. And, sometimes we miss a few details. Sometimes we get it wrong and that's fine, But
and you introduced me to Newsies at your house, which was very cool. And which, by the way,
really?
Oh, you know that Orthodox Jews are like they really like that musical. Well, because it's like clean and you can like show it to kids. Yeah.
That's why we loved it.
Is it the same? See, there's so many similarities. I'm telling you.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. It was just like so wholesome, and music. I mean, we love, we can't get enough of music. I want to hear more about your memories because I feel like you remember things better than I did.
It was also like a novelty to me. In some ways, for example, one time it was just an ordinary Christmas for you, but because I was at your house at Christmas and it was like my first Christmas, that's why I remember that, right? So, and I remember you just being like, oh my gosh, you've never had a Christmas. Okay, we have to make sure she opens the presents. Like, we have to make sure she hangs them. Like, every Christmas tradition, we're like, you have to do this, like, get these ones. And you kept telling people like, this is her first Christmas. Let her, like, whatever it was, like, let her do this or that. Like, and I felt so special because there were a lot of people there at your family's house for Christmas. And you guys were like rolling out the red carpet for it. It was so sweet.
That's so cool. I remember that. I still have that scarf that you knitted for me. Was it that same Christmas or was it a different time?
Oh, it must have been. I was super into knitting. Right now, I'm knitting a scarf. Yeah.
Oh, I love that. I love that. It's one of the few things that I've like kept no matter where I move, You always like purge stuff wherever you go, but that's one of the few things that I've kept all these years.
Nice.
Yeah. It was so sweet. Before we move on to the next question, are there any other memories that you can think of growing up the way you did with your particular religion in your household? Did you come to a point in your teenage years or maybe later where you decided this is the thing that I want to practice? You know, this is what I believe, these are my values, and so this is the way I want to practice it.
That's such a good question. It was constantly evolving for me. I was very aware of being part of a minority religion, but because basically when I was like around 9, my parents both had some medical issues, there was things going on at home, and they like just sort of stopped taking me to synagogue, and we would just do the holidays at home, basically like Hanukkah and Passover, and like maybe a little bit like dress up on Purim, but not all of the major holidays. It sort of fell more and more into the background of life, but there was a lot of Jewish cultural stuff like Hebrew and Yiddish words being thrown in. I didn't even realize there was sort of a Jewish worldview that was being imparted to me sometimes. I didn't realize till like 2 years ago that most people don't necessarily observe the anniversary of the death of a close loved one with like special specific candles and like special specific prayers. I didn't know that wasn't like universal. Because I remember somebody wrote on Facebook, oh my gosh, what if there was such thing as a death day anniversary? I'm like, do you mean a yard site? Like, doesn't everybody have, what's the word in English? I'm like, oh, they don't have that in English. That was like my whole life. I didn't realize that was a Jewish cultural thing. So just stuff like that, even if my parents weren't super religious, feeling like part of a minority culture where it's like, I'd very often have to choose between, especially like in college and grad school, I'd have to choose between like, do I hand in this assignment on time or do I come to class this day? Or do I tell them, hey, that's a major holiday in my religion? Like just always having to ask myself that question. And then if I do ask for that day off, is the teacher going to be like, okay, is the teacher going to be mean about it or like pretend to be nice about it, but actually like secretly judge me for like not being Jewish enough outside of that or like whatever. So it's just always that type of, and also just general culture stuff. I feel like in strict orthodoxy, like definitely, or like how my parents raised me also, which was also just like, they're a little old fashioned, my parents, or a little traditional and old-fashioned just in general, like sex is definitely for within marriage, but it's not really, even if you're quite strict, it's not really the type of thing in Judaism where they're like, oh my gosh, sex is only for procreation, or like there is no concept that sex is inherently, emphasis on inherently, a sin. There's not really, whereas I feel like in the American cultural landscape, constantly referring to sex as kind of like dirty, nasty, you know, almost like this very base thing. And even if somebody would call themselves an atheist, they would totally understand the concept quite well that there's something like inherently sinful or naughty or dirty or whatever about sex. And that's almost like part of our language. Whereas inherently, I would say something in Judaism, maybe you would say it's something very private, something really only between like husband and wife, you know, that's the traditional thing, or only within marriage. But I never got the sense that it was inherently bad or even only for procreation.
That's so similar.
Yeah.
That's so similar to Mormonism too, that within marriage, it's like a great, wonderful, beautiful, God-given thing, you know?
Party down if you're within marriage.
Right. But don't you dare touch each other before your wedding night. Right. You know, and I think that goes back to kind of the American purity culture, you know, that started in like the 70s or the 80s or so. That idea that you really, really got to save yourself. Nobody wants a licked cupcake. Did you ever get those analogies when you were growing up of like the licked cupcake and crap like that?
No, fortunately, we didn't. There was nothing. And as far as I remember from Hebrew school, they just scrupulously avoided any topic like that.
We talked about chastity. It's called, you know, being chaste. We had lessons on chastity. Oh gosh, like at least once every other month as teenagers. It was like, oh my gosh, like can we not talk about this again? Like we get it, okay? We get it. Anyway, it was so important. But then people have a hard time feeling like, no, that's shameful. I can't even think about it. Like you have to thought police yourself because you can't even sin in your mind by thinking about it, right? And then you're supposed to just like turn it on your wedding night. And that can be really, really hard for a lot of people who have gotten really, really good at the thought policing and like keeping all your feelings in check. so there's never any kind of thought sin whatsoever.
That sounds
Anyway,
to me
sorry.
like more, but that's more like I've heard of that in the context of like very strict, sort of the more insular streams or sects of Judaism. As I mentioned to you before, I volunteer as an English teacher with people who grew up in communities that were very, very insular, to the extent where they're pretty much only speaking Yiddish in those communities. They want to sort of isolate from the outside English speaking world, even though they're, located in the United States. I'm more aware of those type of extremely strict rules, to this extent where you're sort of thought policing yourself, and there is also that concept of like, well, if I do this, if I do something like, if I don't dress properly, I could cause somebody else to sin by, they would have an impure thought. Like, to the extent where you're always thinking like, okay, what if I cause, what I mean? Like something else to happen. I say I'm a volunteer English teacher, but I also, so much of what I sort of teach is American culture, because it's hard to teach a language without cultural context.
Mm-hmm.
So, if we're doing like a practice reading passage to study for the high school equivalency exam, and we're just like, okay, during the Civil War, Abraham Lincoln, and it's just like, okay, well, first of all, what's the Civil War? And second of all, who's Abraham Lincoln? So just kind of taking a step back, and just anything that you might take for granted as like American culture. If somebody was, in a school that basically pretty much more or less taught religious studies, either primarily or completely, then that's a totally different like cultural frame of reference. It might be more compared to like, in Mormonism, are there groups that sort of isolate, like don't want to talk to anybody who's not in their religion?
Yeah. So in Mormonism, it's all about like following the leader, right? There's always got to be a leader. And so if you have a group of people that says, this leader must be a fallen prophet, actually God's calling me, you all need to follow me, and they'll get like a following. This happened especially like right in the early days. So the religion was founded by Joseph Smith back in the 1830s. Right when he died, there was this big like, oh, who's going to be the next leader, right? And some people followed one guy, some people followed another guy, and so you have these like offshoots. The main one that people mostly know about is Brigham Young. He led all the pioneers out west, Utah, and the Indian Territory, and then they tried to set up a theocracy and had pressure from the U.S. government, and eventually they like settled down and became a state. But then there was the whole polygamy thing, and so the leader, at that time when Utah was applying for statehood, but they couldn't get it because polygamy was an issue. So he issued this proclamation: all right, we're not doing polygamy. It's fine. We're good. Like, we don't need to do that anymore. God said so. So, but then you've got these offshoots that are like, whoa, no, like polygamy was and always is a core tenet of Mormonism. So, we're going to go off and we're going to do our thing. And so then you've got like the FLDS and the Warren Jeffs and, the polygamous compounds there, where it's like really, really forced polygamy. And then you've got offshoots that are like, well, we're not going to force that on anybody, but like, we think that's a good way of life, So, and then you've got like lots of other offshoots too. So there's different sects in that way, in that they're all following different leaders. But then you've got like the one main, the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints. But almost all of these sects call themselves Mormon. I've honestly never met in person someone from these different offshoots, but I don't imagine that people from the different offshoots would get along very well. As a Mormon, I could sit down with people of other religions and other faiths, and we could get along and have things in common. But I think when you're so close, but there's like a small like fundamental rift, these are a really, really, really big deal. And we've changed our whole lifestyles and the place where we live and stuff because of these things. That's hard to overcome and be good friends with.
Yeah. So. I'm not, and never have been, either modern Orthodox or open Orthodox, but I've heard they have like this rift between, there's like a few little issues where they have these rifts, and it's a little bit like, I was about to give an analogy of two different sports teams, and then I realized I don't know any sports teams because I don't know anything about sports. Well, I was at my brain trying to find a sports analogy. I don't know.
It's like Brian Regan. Call my favorite sports team. Brian Regan is also a favorite among Mormons because he's so clean and wholesome.
Right. Okay. Yes.
Yeah.
That makes sense. That tracks.
I use that same kind of sports kind of analogy previously for someone too that was like, wouldn't all Christians just get along? Like, no. I mean, that's like if you've got a bunch of people who really like sports in the same room, and one person likes football, another person likes baseball, another person likes basketball, and there's another person who likes baseball. The two baseball people there, if they root for different teams, they're going to be at each other's throats more than anybody else will.
Yeah, it's almost like sometimes when you get an Orthodox person and a very Reformed person in the room, it's almost like they're so different that it's almost just like, look, let's just be cousins or like whatever. Whereas if you have people like very similar but like different on some key things, that can be quite contentious sometimes.
Yeah.
You know, as I've watched your previous videos, it really strikes me. I mean, some of it I'm just like, okay, well, this is not really relevant to what I know about Judaism, but that's something I'm like, oh my gosh, if you just change that word to like a Hebrew or Yiddish word, it's like we're talking about the exact same topic. Okay, so I volunteer with a group that helps people. It started out as helping people who've recently left like an insular community. There are volunteer services available, such as English tutoring, which is what I do. Sometimes, social workers volunteer, or just sometimes people who help set people up with jobs or like help them brush up their resume or like find jobs. So there's all kind of volunteers within this organization. Anyways, not everybody who is like a member of that organization has left or fully left that community, their community of origin. So it's interesting. So some people have left, some people are still in, but then kind of secretly go to these meetings for people who are either questioning their strict upbringing, and sometimes for people it's very hard. They're so situated in their community, their ability to be part of their family and have their family continue talking to them, their ability to keep their job. All of these things are contingent on them remaining in the community. Or maybe they're having doubt, like religious doubts, or maybe they're just having, maybe not even doubts, but they're like, wait, there is no rule that says we're not allowed to learn English. Why can't I learn English? Then maybe I could get a different job that I like better or that supports my family better. Like, so sometimes people don't even want to leave, but they're like, wait, there's no actual rule for X, Y, or Z, so why can't I do it? But within the tradition of their specific community, like they would be looked upon badly for doing certain things.
Yeah. They would lose some social currency.
Right. So once something happens, once there's a tipping point, like sort of once, for example, if you have kids and you're deemed to have done something inappropriate, maybe it's found out that you have a TV in your home. People who are that strict, insular in certain, or you have the internet at home. So if they're I'm talking about like very, 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 very strict. I'm not talking about Orthodox, like the way like Joe Lieberman is Orthodox, or the guy who played, Big on Sex and the City is Orthodox, or the way Mayim Bialik from Blossom/Big Bang Theory is Orthodox. I'm talking about like very insular, very strict communities where they kind of have a sort of a specific dress code. Maybe they mostly speak Yiddish. I'm really afraid I'm going to get in trouble for like generalizing or not being specific enough.
Is there a name for that kind of community, or is it something we cannot say?
It's kind of hard. So I can't even generalize by saying Hasidic. Not all Hasidic people are that strict. I've heard the term ultra-Orthodox, but some people find that sort of pejorative, but it might be like a term that is more familiar to people, just in sort of the very isolated, insular communities that are maybe like mostly or all Yiddish speaking, that really keep to themselves and have certain customs where they don't want to really interact with outsiders very much. I'm just sort of, there's not one name. There are multiple sects that could fit that description in different places in the world. New York, Canada, London, all over the world, certainly in Israel. So you couldn't just name like with one label. Oh, that reminds me of another memory.
I'm excited.
I don't know. Feel free to cut any of this stuff, honestly. I remember we were at your house. We'd just gone to your house either after school or just to hang out. And I remember your mom was drinking tea. Okay. And I remember you were just like, wait a minute, Mom, what kind of tea is that? And she was like, I don't know. I got it from the box. She looked on the box and it was a mix of different, like those mixes of different. And you were like, Mom, I think this one you're drinking actually has caffeine in it. And she was like, oh my gosh. Oh, I think it's just like chamomile. It says the word chamomile on the box. And you're like, yeah, it's a mix of chamomile, this, that, and that. And she's just like, or like something like I already started drinking it, or just like, anyways, feel free to cut that if you don't. And you were just kind of like, Mom, you're not allowed to drink that.
My siblings and I were so good at policing each other, and even my parents too. Oh my gosh. Like, it's such
like, oh my gosh,
a
you're not allowed to
big
drink
deal.
caffeine. Like, because I think that's when I learned about the rule. Because I think I didn't know that rule. And that was like how I found out about that rule. I was like, wow, that's strict. I knew you couldn't drink alcohol. But I was just like, wow, you can't drink tea. Like, wow.
I know, strict. Right? It is strict. And there's no good reason for it.
That I won't opine on.
I'm so sorry, Mom. I'm sorry I gave you a hard time about your tea. My dad would get a Coke every once in a while. And although there's no like specific rules against Coke or caffeinated drinks, and it's a little complicated, but there's no specific rule against caffeinated sodas. But really? Like by practice, traditionally, like we just wouldn't do that. And so if there was ever an activity and there was soda involved, it was always caffeine-free Diet Coke or just
like
Sprite or something.
Is 7-Up? Yeah, is 7-Up.
7-Up doesn't have caffeine.
Yeah, because I remember at the cast parties for these things, it was be like, excuse me, is there any 7-Up? Because me and my friends, we all go to seminary together. We need 7-Up. Like, I remember you're always just like standing up for yourself. You're like, I'm going to drink soda at this. And I need 7. Like, I remember that because I'm like, I need to learn how to stand up for myself like that. Anyway.
Oh, I cringe. Like, but I'm glad that ended up being like a cool thing. That's nice that you're able to take something good out of that instead of like, God, she is off her rocker. Like, it's just
I mean, look, I'm literally a vegan now. So it's like, first of all, I've had to learn how to be like, I don't eat or drink that. And also not care what people think about me because people don't like vegans. And I'm like, no, if you knew me,
which is weird. Like, why don't people like vegans? I don't get it. I don't understand that. I don't understand that. Well, it's that's like, a fun memory.
You got to joke about somebody, I guess. Joke about vegans. I'll take it. I have a sense of humor.
Yeah.
I wrote on somebody, like, she's like a friend. She's a friend from comedy. And I wrote on her, she said something like, why do vegans, like, they always have to tell everybody? And I wrote on her, well, I'm like, well, maybe some of your friends are vegan, but they're your friends, but you don't know they're vegan because they never bring it up to you. And she's like, what are you talking about? I'm like, I'm vegan. And I'm like, oh, I ruined it. I'm like, but you didn't know till you didn't know till then, right?
See, yeah, like I wasn't evangelizing to you. I wasn't being naggy. Okay, so I do want to go back to talking about your volunteer group and what you do there. And if we could talk about the people who come to that group, right? What kind of services are they looking for? Why are they leaving their communities? Why are they seeking the services that you have there?
That's a good question. So due to the nature of what I do, which is basically teaching sometimes beginner's English, sometimes more intermediate English, or sometimes teaching English for the, high school equivalency exam, I'm mostly working with people from the absolute most insular, isolated, very, very, very strict communities, because those tend to be the communities that have held on to Yiddish and have tried to make sure their children either learn basically as little English as legally allowed, and maybe sometimes even less than that in school. And in these very, very strict insular communities, the children are in school studying religious studies, but they tend to not get high school diplomas. So a lot of people who I've worked with personally, they're sort of representing the most strict community, where the other strict Orthodox people are like, wow, those people are strict. Like that is the group of people I'm working with. And there'll be all those like small differences among different sects. They'll be like, yeah, of course a husband and wife shouldn't ever like hold hands in public, but they'll just be like, but those sects where they have like the wives walking behind the husband, it's like, whoa, we would never do that. But like, of course, you're forbidden to like hold hands above. So I'm looking at them thinking they're strict. We're looking at these other people thinking they're too strict.
Of course.
They could come to this volunteer organization for a number of different reasons. So some people, they are trying to find ways to leave their community. So sometimes that might mean looking for help, applying for high school, studying for and taking high school equivalency tests. Depending on what city or sect a person is from, that may be like the culture of their community to not give secular high school diplomas, or not a high school diploma that would be recognized by anybody outside the community.
Does that make it hard to get a job? I mean, they would only be able to get a job within the community then. Right. I mean, I suppose the purpose of that is to keep them more insular. Right? Like if someone can't even leave, they have to stay, and that helps our community be even more tight-knit, right? And even stronger bonds together. But then difficult for a person maybe who can't find a job within their community. right? Or is unsatisfied.
Being in the United States and not speaking fluent English could also be a barrier to an incredibly large number of jobs. So, and then not having a high school diploma. So also bear in mind, this is a community where there's incredibly intense pressure to get married at age 18.
Oh, so there's like a set age. And is that for men and women? It's 18.
So it depends. So there's like a saying kind of like 18 into the wedding altar. It's totally depends on the community. And some communities that are like strictly Orthodox, but not as insular and strict as communities I'm usually working with. Yeah, maybe up to like early 20s is pretty typical. But then once you're mid 20s, especially for women, it's a little bit like, whoa, you know, starting to get a little bit like, oh, you know, why did you? Right. So bear in mind in any,
sounds familiar.
Pretty much any strain of Orthodox. If somebody's calling themselves Orthodox, they are usually, especially strict Orthodox or pious or from or Haredi, they just literally will not touch the opposite gender except for maybe like immediate family.
Wow.
Not even like touching hands. So it just kind of depends how strict a person is. So if they're in a little bit more of like a lenient community, there's also sort of I guess you would call it more like a rule than a strict law. There's also a rule about not embarrassing people needlessly, right? So if you're like at a work conference in a room milling around and someone of a different gender like reaches out their hand to shake your hand, it just sort of depends. So some people might just be like, hey, nothing personal. It's just against my religion to shake it. And some people might just clearly it's not meant in any type of inappropriate. Some people might use their judgment and go based on what the rabbi has said in previous situations and just be like,
gotcha.
Preventing embarrassment, you know what I mean? Like, so it sort of depends on how you, but in the strictest communities, there just wouldn't even be an opportunity. That would just be so forbidden.
Yeah, gotcha. What would you call a congregation? So like, these are the people that go to this particular synagogue. Is there a term for that? Like for Mormons, we call it like your ward.
So you can go to whichever synagogue or congregation you want. You're not like assigned to anything. Whichever place is your comfort. Like, yes, I'm comfortable with the liturgy and the strictness, and I like what the rabbi. That's cool.
You get to pick and choose a little bit.
Totally.
Cool. Very cool. Yeah, that's very different from Mormonism. Like you go to your assigned word and that's the congregation that you do all the stuff with. That's who you worship with. That's who you sit with in Sunday school and you do all your activities with. Like, you don't get to hop around and find which is the best fit for you, unfortunately.
Really? You can just be like, the next county over has like a later starting seminary. I don't know.
Right.
I know it's corny for teachers to be like, my students have taught me just as much as I've taught them, if not more. But it's so true, because it's very hard to teach English just completely absent of culture, and also just merely, especially pre-pandemic when we were having in-person lessons, just merely interacting with somebody who essentially you're almost from two different cultures, except that like I know some of the rules of their culture, they know some of the rules of my culture, but sometimes we're bumping up against assumptions. And some assumptions can be on either end, although as each person I work with, I have learned more. And I've tried to do background reading, like studying up about certain, so for example, the very, very first time I'm meeting someone, if they've like just left the community, I'm not going to try to shake their hand, right? Like that might make them uncomfortable.
Yeah.
And like, I'll give them permission. I'll be like, here's how I like to greet people. Hey. And then it gives them permission. They'll be like, okay, like they could be like, hey, so I make it like, okay, here's what we can do. This is there's numerous ways to say hello, right? So I usually start there, but then later it's like, usually in this situation, like if we're like kind of talking about cultural stuff, I'll be like, usually like remember when we first met, I just waved hi. I mean, yes, of course you can say hi that way, but usually people, regardless of whether they're men or women, would usually shake hands, and they might be like, oh, as if it's two men meeting. I'm like, yes, as if exactly. I remember one of them was like, but if you're not religious, because they knew I was a less religious Jewish person, they'd be like, but like, what do you do on Saturday? And I give examples. I'll be like, well, I might go shopping. And something clicked. I'm like, oh, so it's almost like you have two Sundays. I'm like, yes, it's like I have two Sundays. Exactly. What a good way of putting it. Like,
Yeah, in the ex-Mormon community, we like to say it's Sunday fun day, because now we get like two Saturdays, as opposed to we had a Saturday before, and then you had your Sunday full of like worship and church service and church callings and responsibilities and things all revolving around church. So now that you don't have that anymore, it's like, woohoo, Sunday fun day. I get to do Saturdays. It's a 2-day weekend. Love it.
Tangent with another high school memory. Rachel, you can cut it out if you don't like it.
No, I'm going to keep all these in. This is great. This is so fun for me.
You didn't do anything embarrassing in this. I'm just going to start off by saying you didn't do anything wrong. In fact, you did something very, very nice, which was, do you remember there were like 4 wings, I want to say, of our school, and 2 of them, they're like 2 different buildings and like 4 sections. And
yeah.
my friends had lockers in like the 400s. I think this was senior year, maybe.
Okay.
And I randomly had a locker in the farthest in the 100. So like the farthest part, different building, different floor.
Yeah.
And what was sweet of you is because all of my classes were in near basically everybody else's locker. And I kind of stood in that hall one day before school because people would hang out by the lockers and chat. Be like, hey, does anybody want to let me like keep just a few key heavy books just in your locker so that I don't have to, like, I have scoliosis, I have a back brace, like, so I don't have to run. And you were the only person who volunteered to share your locker with me. Thank you for that. And I remember it was so sweet of you to share your locker with me. And I went home and I told my parents, and I was so sweet. And I told them something that I thought they would find like humorous because they were so chill about letting me go to church with you sometimes. I was just like, can you believe like your Jewish daughter has a picture of JC, which is what we always call them in our house to prevent like being disrespectful, has like a picture of JC. I thought they'd be like, you're right, that's hilarious. Oh, he was a Jew, you know, I thought they'd see something like that, but they were like, are you serious? Well, why don't you tell her you're Jewish? And like, maybe she'll take it down. And I'm like, she's being nice enough to let me share her, like, she's my only friend who will let me use her locker. Like, I tell her to take a picture down from there. And they were just like, well, I never, like, they were very just kind of like alarmed. I don't know why. Anyways, that's like a funny story from my end. I should be embarrassed of anything, but that was, thank you.
It's another thing that, like,
locker.
I don't even remember. Like, it wasn't even a big deal for me.
There was like a big, it took up the whole top part. It was a big picture of him.
Oh, I remember, because the seniors got different lockers, didn't we? It was like a senior privilege.
Yeah, something like that. It was definitely senior year that this happened. Like, that's why all the lockers are for hanging out before school.
Yeah.
So I appreciate
that's so fun.
Some stuff in there.
My pleasure.
Gosh, like, what else were we talking about?
Also, well, we're talking about services. So people coming to the volunteer organization that you're part of, they come.
Yes.
You help teach them English.
So sometimes because come learn English. Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Okay. All right. And that's your specialty there is English. And if I may just put in a plug for what you do for a living, can you talk about that real quick? Let's just interject that here real quick.
Okay. I wear many hats. I'm a hat model. No, just kidding. That's so silly. I don't even know why I said that. I'm a speech language pathologist, and I also work with parents and educators as a bilingual parenting consultant because my area of focus within speech language pathology is bilingual issues. I'm a bilingual speech language pathologist who speaks Russian and Spanish and French, and I have certifications in all of those languages. And what else did I want to say about me? What else do I do? I'm an accent and dialect coach.
Spanish and French as well. Oh, sorry, I interrupted again. I forgot Spanish and French. That's so cool. Sorry. So coaching what? Tell me again.
Accent and dialect coaching.
Which means?
I teach somebody an American accent who wants to be taught an American accent. So I've worked with everybody from physicians from Russia to actors from London. It's not exactly English lessons what I usually do. It's just sort of that, only the pronunciation and articulation part of English class. Yeah. And what else do I do?
And then you said you also do stand-up comedy, which is so fun. And you're so good at it. And I can't wait for you to send me all of the recordings that you've ever done so I can catch up.
I'm blushing because I don't like talking about myself. It goes against my religion of being modest. Modesty is a big rule in my religion. That's why I'm blushing and talking about myself.
There's this thing that we say called modest is hottest.
Oh, that's I've never heard that one before.
And of course, when Mormons talk about modesty, we're always talking about girls wearing clothing obviously. Covering up.
In the strict Orthodox religion, it is mostly girls who are getting the talkings to about modesty. Although like technically everybody is supposed to be modest, but in practice it very strictly applies to women and girls.
And are you speaking about modesty in dress as far as like covering up, or modesty in not tooting your own horn kind of thing.
Oh, well, definitely dress. So another example of modesty would be maybe like, don't post a million selfies, even if you're in modest dress all over the place. It's kind of a little bit like you can't quite pin down a definition of modesty. It's a little bit like, depending on which community you're in, it's a little bit like, I'll know it when I see it. So singing in front of men, for women, singing in front of men is considered immodest, or even like giving a speech in front of men could be considered immodest. Or like performing in a play in front of men could be immodest. So like if there are speeches like by and for women, or plays or choir performances by and for women. Yeah. So that's, something that happens in strict Orthodox communities. Yeah. Or just like all female dance classes or things like that. So that could also be kind of an aspect of modesty.
Gotcha.
Not making a spectacle of yourself, kind of, if you will.
Yeah. That never ever gets talked about in Mormonism. I mean, I can say never, there's always going to be like a few church leaders here and there, but on the whole, like that's not a big deal. And so you have a lot of Mormon influencers, especially like stay-at-home moms, who are doing their side hustle, being a social media influencer, and, having photographers come and showing, this is how I spend my day with my kids, and, things like that. So yeah, that part I would say is pretty different. Modesty is only ever used to talk about covering up your body. That's it.
Yeah. And sometimes I feel like it's so visible that, and this even bothered me when even when I was younger, I was sort of somehow both in and not in that culture at the same time. I remember having an argument with one of my friends, like, is it better to wear, I think the rule is like, the more Orthodox rule is like your knee has to be covered by your skirt. Then you can get into details. It's like, if you're standing or sitting, or like, it can get into detail.
Yeah.
Or it's like, and are you more pious if when you're sitting, it still covers your knee plus 3 inches? Or is it okay to just cover it? Like, so I remember getting into arguments with my friends. And also because depending on what community you're in, is it a rule for women to wear skirts? Or if the woman wears kind of modest, like sort of flowy pants. I remember having an argument with friends and I just thought you'd be better off wearing like loose flowy pants, because they're also not supposed to be too tight, right? And that's modest. And they were like, well, no, because it has to be a skirt for a woman. So even if it's kind of a tight skirt that barely meets the length, that is always inherently better, because skirts are inherently better than pants. Like I remember having this argument with somebody, right, like a million years ago. All that kind of jaded.
It's really interesting.
These things jaded me towards religion, because it was always really hammered into me, like the superficial didn't matter. I mean, you went to my parents' house growing up, right? Do you think they thought the superficial mattered? I made a little joke about my parents' house not exactly being like a Pottery Barn catalog or whatever. But like on the bright side, I was just taught, don't worry so much about the designer clothes. Wait a minute, maybe it was all just an elaborate ploy because my parents didn't want to spend a lot of money on my clothing. Like it's not like the outside,
they're really
house,
smart.
just the inside, yeah, like don't worry too much. Don't agonize about it. And yeah, I remember when I was really little, I went to like an Orthodox day camp, and the boys and girls, I think they had like different swim times or whatever. And I remember my parents just sort of ignorantly just sent me with a bathing suit, but I was also supposed to bring like a really baggy, like maybe my dad's t-shirt to wear over the bathing suit for modesty, even though it was like girls swim.
As a little kid?
Yeah, so I was like 6, 7, 8.
Gotcha.
Yeah. So it's because it was that strict. And I don't think that even if the children were like over bar bat mitzvah age, so if the kids were over like 12 or 13, I don't think they might have let the boys and girls be in the same camp at all if they were older. I don't know. Because we were kept separate for like everything, like eating and swimming, just for everything. But yeah, I remember being so embarrassed that like I didn't always know all the rules, or like I knew some of the prayers, but not all of them. So there would be like a half an hour's worth of prayers. I forget whether it was before or after a meal. Whereas maybe in my family, we might do a sentence or two of prayer, right? Like thanks God for the bread, but like the Hebrew version or something like that. Or like thanks God for the grapes or like whatever.
Yeah.
But in Hebrew, obviously. But they would do this, and I remember kind of mumbling along with it, and I'd be like, and I'd like randomly know random words. I'd be like, ata, and I remember them like making fun of me. Nobody wanted to be my friend because my parents sent me in a t-shirt and shorts, which was like not acceptable, and like I didn't really know the prayers. I know I was like had no friends, and then like I brought a bathing suit, but they had to like lend me a t-shirt.
Wow.
didn't look good on me because the other girls had better, cooler t-shirts or whatever.
Oh, that's so hard at that age too. I mean, that's hard at any
Nobody
age.
likes me. I think my parents just, I don't know what they were just kind of like, she'll be fine. It led to some cultural misunderstanding. I thought I was Jewish before that, but then I went to this camp. I'm like, wait, am I Jewish? And I had a little bit of like, well, what's happening? That really probably somebody should have sat me down and just been like, this is the difference between Orthodox and whatever we are. But no, they just let me figure it out. And they sent me to that camp for like 3 years in a row until I got old enough to be like, I'm not going back. Please don't send me to this camp anymore.
So this is a day camp, just like during the summer break. Gotcha.
Yeah. And it was close to my parents' house. That's probably why they sent me. They're like, wow, it's close to her house and it's like extremely reasonably priced. Let's just send her there. And then think hard about it.
Did they know? I mean, I assume you came home and you told them, whoa,
I don't know.
what's happening
Kids are
here?
weird. When I got home, I was so relieved to be home. Also, I have to say the food was so good. They were like all homemade meals. It almost made up for everything else. The food was so good. I still remember the taste of the potato kugel, which is just like I don't know. It's like this yummy potato casserole. Oh, so good. Like all these different, and they fresh bake challah every Friday. Oh, so good.
That sounds
of course,
amazing.
that was the girls' activity for the day. I don't know what the boys were doing, but it was kind of fun. Anyways.
Did you like that, or were you like, damn
yeah?
it?
Yeah, no, I actually did like that. I actually thought it was fun.
Oh, good. Well, that was. I think that's probably another reason you and I were such good friends too. That's the kind of thing that I would be interested in also. When we did our girls' activities, it wasn't fun and exciting and adventurous like the boys' activities were, because sexism and way different budgets, for the young women's program versus the young men's program. I liked it, like let's make cupcakes, let's decorate cookies, let's make bread, and let's do crafts. And it didn't even occur to me that there is any unfairness, because it's like, I like doing this stuff anyway. So I would love to learn how to make challah.
Okay, you want to hear something funny that Paul Hollywood did? Why am I calling him out? I've been watching a lot of the Great British Baking Show. He apparently wrote in his book. First of all, it's like everything about his challah recipe was wrong. Like, so he spelled it Cholla, which nobody spells it that way.
No.
First of all, I'm like, okay. He's like, the challah.
Hang on a second. That's cholla. That's Cholla is a type of cactus. It's a cholla cactus. It's the jumping cholla.
Maybe it was autocorrect. See,
maybe that's
who have seen a cactus in your life, whereas I don't think I have. You would probably know more about that than I do. But I'm like, okay, how can this get me worse? And then he's just like, this bread is traditionally eaten on Passover. Now, Rachel, you grew up with Jewish people.
What the heck?
Clearly, could he not have one Jewish friend proofread this recipe? I'm like, the only holiday you don't eat challah is Passover. Like, because you're not allowed to eat any bread products. It was hilarious.
Yeah. For my viewers, Passover is like, you don't have any bread products in the house. Nothing like yeasty or anything. Nothing that would take like a slow rise. That's like the whole point of Passover. Or maybe not the whole point, but like that's a big deal. Oh my gosh. What?
When you publish something like that, it's like, get somebody to read. So I think that's kind of funny. I'm not like insulting, or whatever, but it's just kind of,
I would.
If you want to make any dish for your family to just eat at home, and if you want to challenge yourself, make like an 8 plaited braid or like, or just 6. Like I find 6 hard enough, to be honest with you.
I might start with 3. See how it goes.
Right. Exactly. And it's easier to start
I'll
with.
practice on my hair first.
Right. Start with the small ones so you could like tell when it's done. Oh my gosh. When people try to start with the big ones, you're like knocking on the bottom. You're like, what's it supposed to sound like? Just start with a small one at first. Or make a bunch of small ones, one for each kid, something like that.
That'd be so cute. That'd be so cute. Yeah. Okay. Well, I guess it's not cultural appropriation too, if I'm not like using it and being like, look at this new recipe that I created.
Right. You're like, I invented a recipe. It's called challah. Like, don't do that. Like that would be bad. But if you're just feeding it to your kid, I mean, I feed my family whatever recipe I just randomly find, and I don't worry about what's culture it's from necessarily. I'm like, I'm just feeding it to my family. Nobody will know. I don't know if I made a call it since in the past 3 years. Look, I have a kid. If I tried to make dough, she'd just play with it and throw it on the floor.
Okay. Where were we? Okay, I want to talk more about the religious aspect and things that my viewers would find relatable, and me too. So talk to me about the people that you work with. We've established they're from different communities, right? They're from different communities.
Your question from before.
If you can just tell us a little bit of the stories or a little bit of your story of, these are the kinds of things that I see when people are coming out of these communities, is that difficult for them? Can you talk about that, what that transition in life is like for them?
Sure. I mean, I'm going to have to paint in broad strokes. And like I said, I'm mostly working with people who are from the most insular of the most insular, because by their nature of the Yiddish speaking communities that are trying to even avoid contact with the outside English speaking world. So that's like inherently quite strict. And because they go to these meetings and they hear from people who are from also very strict sects, but are less strict. But remember, they've maybe not been allowed to have contact with them. There's definitely a path to exploration. What I've heard from many people is you're learning so much and you don't know what are you supposed to unlearn. So things you've been taught growing up, maybe about the outside world. You know, some people are taught everybody in the outside world hates us, and everybody who's not Jewish hates Jews. Like they've been maybe taught things like that. They have this little bit of like, wait, what was I taught? What is true and what isn't true? So it's probably not true that everything I was ever taught in my whole life is untrue, but also it's finding your own path. And by the way, ironically, leaving within the ultra Orthodox community, they call it going off the path. That's what like they call it, going off the derech, going off the path.
Very similar to Mormonism. It's like leaving the covenant path. Yeah.
Oh, okay. So it's like the same. So OTD, off the derech, is a shorthand.
Gotcha.
Strict Orthodox communities. I guess everybody's family reacts different ways. I don't want to generalize. You know, there are some people who are from pretty strict communities and their parents don't cut them off after they left, and their parents still love them and are just like supportive parents like you'd expect. But it seems to me more often, just based on what I've seen, if they fully leave, they won't be able to have contact. People, whether it's family, friends, coworkers, former classmates, people may very well cut them off in many communities. So remember, a lot of people are getting married at 18. Well, what does that mean? Maybe they're having kids when they're 19 or 20. The cost of leaving gets extremely high once you bring children into it.
Yes.
As you can imagine. Because the whole society will sort of give together and help monetarily with the parent who is staying religious and staying in the community, help them fund a great lawyer.
Yeah.
And the person, maybe they don't have a high school diploma, maybe they don't speak English so well, maybe they just don't have a lot of money because maybe just their parents just cut them off. It's so hard with custody issues, and that is part of what contributes to sometimes people just choosing to stay in their job in the community, in their family in the community, especially if they're maybe married and have kids, or just kind of having that outlet of being able to like go to meetings outside of, or just other events or activities in the outside world.
So there's a term in Mormonism for that too. I mean, it's not like an official term, but like we say someone is physically in but mentally out. So it's PIMO. So a person with like that, they would be PIMO. They'd be physically in, but mentally like they're not happy with this. They're not satisfied. They maybe have doubts. They maybe had a faith crisis or a faith transition and no longer believe, or, just wish something different for their life. But for social reasons, maybe, they would lose custody of their kids if there was a divorce or separation, or might lose their job because they lose their clients. So for various social reasons, there's intense pressure to stay or just to at least put on a good show and pretend.
There's a documentary on Netflix called One of Us. The documentary is so great. And One of Us is just such even just you can tell by the name of it, right? It follows 3 people who have left very, very strict Orthodox communities. And they're all like have very different situations. But one of them, it's a heartbreaking story. It's basically a mother who's left and she's also trying to, struggle to get custody with her kids. So anyway, you had asked me way back about what are the services people are seeking. So sometimes people are seeking a lawyer for either help with a divorce or custody, and maybe, and there are lawyers who like volunteer work pro bono, or maybe somebody just needs somebody to talk to. They might need a social worker who's like culturally sensitive, who understands these issues. And sometimes they need like job seeking help. Sometimes, and sometimes volunteers just do kind of one-off, like they'll be an expert on some topic and they'll do maybe a one-off presentation, or they'll be there to do informational interviews. There's just so many different ways. There's so many different things that volunteers do. Or sometimes volunteers they'll have some kind of event at the organization. And, the volunteers a lot of people might have kids, right? So they'll volunteer to do childcare. So that way the person doesn't have to like pay, a babysitter. Yeah, there's all kinds of things volunteers do. There are concerns when people leave the community.
Right.
And so what are maybe the potential downsides? Like I said, if they especially if they have children or they're already married, they might, need help with that. It's just obviously very difficult. Like it's almost like going to a foreign country for them, right? That's what I've heard for them. It's like technically they were born and raised in the US, but they were in this, this insular, its own culture, basically. And maybe certain like norms of how people interact with each other, particularly maybe how men and women interact with each other. Maybe that's just not something they were socialized to be comfortable with. And maybe there's certain, even if they understand the words that somebody is saying in English, things might have like a different meaning, a different implication, a different way of speaking. Or it's like, if you're told your whole life, like the only reason somebody of the other gender, of course, in like the very strict sect, they would consider there to be only two genders. So I'm speaking like from maybe that frame of reference, because like this is the culture maybe they're coming from. There's like no good reason for a man and a woman to ever be alone with each other unless they're going to definitely have sex. So if that's the culture you're raised in, you can imagine this might lead to misunderstandings. And this could be like tricky with work or even just like making new friends type of situations. What other considerations? Sometimes there is such a push, especially if people are like finding out that they're leaving or thinking about leaving, there would be like maybe an incredible push to bring people back into the fold. It can be really intense. Maybe people are following them to see what they're up to, which can be, obviously quite scary. Sherlyn Dean's book, All Who Go Do Not Return, he's a man who left a strict Orthodox community. And there are other books that I read that were quite good. Cut Me Loose, it's by Leah Vincent. And I also really enjoyed this book. And she also wrote quite poignantly about this. Another book that gives insights from more sort of sociological point of view from somebody who's sort of like me, where she's Jewish, but like wasn't raised so strictly. I read Unorthodox by Deborah Feldman.
Is it based on her own story?
Yeah. It's a memoir.
Gotcha.
The book by Hella Winston is called Unchosen, The Hidden Lives of Hasidic Rebels.
What a great title.
Yeah, I think it might have been her sociology thesis. Don't quote me on that. Sorry, I should just be able to Google these things.
I'll link all those books in the description below, so you can check them out.
I mean, sometimes they're asking me about cultural things, maybe certain references, that they heard. So that is kind of part of English class, right? So their coworker or their new friend said something and they didn't know what it meant. And it's like a reference to some 90s Nickelodeon cartoon, but it's like they couldn't have known that, right? Because or whatever, because they weren't allowed to have TVs or the internet at home.
Right.
So it just kind of depends on how Orthodox. So some people will be like, well, we'll have a TV, but we keep it hidden away. Like it just like literally almost every family is different, but we'll kind of keep it hidden away. And like the kids are only allowed to watch videotapes on it. So there's even within pretty strict Orthodox. I hope your viewers don't mind that my camera's falling. my laptop's falling.
Can you tell our viewers what your camera is stacked on?
It is stacked on thousands of dollars worth of my graduate school textbooks. So that's what I'm using my master's degree for. That's great. The most expensive stack like laptop holder ever. I put a small book on top. Okay, so there's just a lot of issues that I haven't even touched on in the Orthodox community. So mostly, I think actually all of the people who I have personally worked with, so I've gone to like general events where I meet various members, like men, women, but mainly the people who, actually I think all of the people I've worked with have been men, because it's really in particular the men who are very, very strictly encouraged to not learn English. And because anything that you do that's like secular studies, such as like learning English or math, takes away from studying religious studies, basically.
So these men, I mean, they sound like they must grow to be like experts in their own religious studies.
Yeah,
but
so
not in a whole lot else, maybe.
Yeah, so it can also be a bit of a loss of identity, which can be hard. So if somebody's thinking about leaving the community, or they just have certain doubts and they want to be able to leave the community a little bit, I mean, I cannot imagine what it takes to leave a community. You have to have just a certain type of confidence or a certain type of intellectual curiosity. It's probably different for everybody, but it must take so much inner strength. Everybody who I've ever worked with has been extremely intelligent, like a fast study. This is like my anecdotal. If you're talented enough to study and interpret, maybe become a rabbi, maybe not specifically become a rabbi, But if you're talented enough to do that, that's an extremely great honor. Like every family would love to have at least one, if not more, sons doing that. I think to maybe go from, let's say, being very, very well respected, a person who's a great source of knowledge or considered like well studied, well learned. People might ask you for advice in terms of studying, and then to go into the outside world, and maybe people might have stereotypes about you based on how you dress, or unfortunately, some people look down on somebody who doesn't speak standard American English or who doesn't have a high school diploma, which is really, really, really messed up. Like I've always known that's messed up. But just, I get frustrated sometimes just thinking about people treating them with anything less than complete respect as an intelligent person who's gone through or going through something very difficult. To fully leave is so hard. They might be cut off by relatives, lose their job. There might be custody issues. Also, yeah, maybe sense of identity. That sense of identity, just becoming, maybe feeling unmoored is sometimes how people, like having to maybe build like your own system of morals and ethics from scratch, figuring out, okay, what is right and wrong? What is true that I've been taught since I've been born, and what do I take and what I leave? Well, what is true? What is false? How do I even know? Because if I was taught, okay, well, somebody older and wiser taught that to you, so therefore it's true. Like, how do you know knowledge? Like, how do you know it's true and not anymore? And so some of it's so difficult. And I mean, and then there's also just sort of the basic everyday stuff, like not knowing everything about culture, or like not quite knowing. So let's say you've always dressed a certain way. Well, what are the fashion rules of this new society I'm going into? And then also sometimes people have to choose, do they have two sets of clothing and then they like have a backpack and they change their clothing when they go out? Or do they, how does that evolve? And I just think it's different for every person who either leaves or who is thinking about leaving, or who they have their home life and they have, life that is sort of in the outside world.
I think that must have produced so much anxiety. I mean, just thinking about the whole identity, like, who am I even? How do I know things? Like, I can really, really relate to that because of my own faith transition, and then losing your community also, and having like nobody, maybe a handful of volunteers, but not really a solid support group right away. And I can relate to that too. But I think, man, like, and all the other things on top of that, like the dress, the language, the jobs, and the education and the culture, and like being in a foreign country and just having no one, especially if your family back home is shunning you or you're losing custody of your kid. It's too easy for people who've never been through that to be like, well, that's just the American dream. You pull yourself up by your bootstraps, you start from scratch with nothing, and you'll be so successful if you just put your mind to it, But really, if you haven't been in that kind of situation, you have no idea what it takes in order to get to that position in the first place, and then to be able to grow from there. It cannot be overstated how important it is to have a sense of self and a sense of identity and a sense of belonging. Like when we talk about one of us, or, you're part of the group, this is like so built into us as Homo sapiens. Like we're social creatures. We live and die with our communities, and we live and die by our stories and our cultures that we tell within our communities, our religions and our politics and our worldviews and our paradigms. And so it really cannot be overstated how important all of that is. And for a person to get to that point where their life inside the in-group must be that bad that they're willing to jump out of it and go through all of this, like it must have gotten pretty bad. And I think that's something to keep in mind also, for us to have compassion, empathy on anybody who's in group and for whatever their own personal reasons feels the need to leave. People who, especially within the Mormon church, when you leave an in-group, in order to maintain the narrative and the tightness, the tight-knit bonds within the in-group, you have to make up stories about why people left. It can't be because there's something unhealthy about our group. It has to be there's something unhealthy about that person, and maybe we don't actually want to have them in our group anyways. And so
we have that too. Well, not we, but
Yeah,
it's like
yeah.
They want to do drugs and be prostitutes. That's why they left, clearly.
Hey, absolutely. Yeah, exact same stories. And it's for any kind of in-group, whether it's a family or a political group or a religion or a cult or whatever it is. Like, you have to make up stories about the people who have left in order to maintain those tight bonds and say, there's nothing wrong here. There's nothing unhealthy about our group. Oh, it just adds so much salt to the wounds and so much insult to injury to people, especially in these insular groups that you're working with, who have done all of that and undergone what we've talked about, and then to have to be villainized by their group back home that they grew up with and loved and trusted and that they identified with, and now to be thrown under the bus by them and villainized by them. And now people are like telling rumors and stories and like, oh, that was really an unhealthy person. We don't even want them back, even if they were to come back, whatever. So much compassion for those people that you're working with, and for anybody in any tight-knit organization that things have gotten to the point where you feel like you need to get out and all that you have to go through. So my heart really, really goes out to them. For sure.
Yeah, it's so hard. And just also, trying to figure out what to unlearn. A lot of people were told, all non-Jews are anti-Semitic against Jews, and they're not going to like you, and you're going to fail, and everybody's going to be out to get you in the outside world, and it's full of drugs and crimes and diseases, and it's quite hard. I mean, so having read Leah Vincent's book, the one I mentioned before, Cut Me Loose, so her parents didn't literally completely cut her off, but she became like a second-class citizen child, or maybe they eventually cut her off, but like at first they'd be like, well, you can come home and eat a meal with us, but everybody else is going to get normal plates and silverware, but you're going to get paper plates and plasticware because you might be diseased, like you've been in the outside world and you might be kind of diseased. Aww. So little things like that, where it's like, well, we're not going to let you give your brother a birthday present. So just like building a wall, sometimes it's various levels. It's not necessarily shunning. I mean, I think every family is different. Yeah. It might just be like, you're no longer going to be put up as a role model for your siblings, or maybe like the parents don't want the younger siblings to be hanging out with you, because it's hard to get into a good school or good seminary or good yeshiva. What was I going to say? Right. Oh, marriage prospects. Oh my gosh. Like if you if you leave, like go off the path and you embarrass your family or cause people to look upon your family negatively, that could hurt your younger siblings, or even maybe your younger cousins or nieces or nephews' marriage prospects, because now there's somebody in the family. So you don't just have to worry about leaving just for yourself, like what will happen to your younger siblings. And that's not even including if somebody's already married with kids. There's very large pressure on people to get married when they're 18, but I think for guys in particular, they can kind of maybe get away with maybe being 19 or 20 or 21 before people kind of look at him like, So I noticed a lot of people I've worked with are like 18, 19, 20. The pressure of marriage became like maybe a do I stay or do I go moment. Because once you get married, and birth control is definitely not allowed. It's not even really talked about. It's kind of like marriage kids, and that's very permanent.
You just like keep having kids as long as you can?
Oh yeah, I mean, birth control is not even allowed. And I've read in different books, I don't ever talk about this with people in real life, because I'm not just randomly going to be like, so let's talk about birth control. But you mentioned Deborah Feldman's book, Unorthodox. I think she specifically mentions this. She literally just didn't know birth control existed. And she was married. She got married when she was 17. Men and women aren't allowed to touch each other until marriage. And the guy doesn't learn really anything until the night before. And then women do get like a few weeks of, it's called like bride classes, where they're maybe taught there's some strict like rules of family purity, where basically like the women and the men, even within the boundaries of marriage, don't touch each other at all during the woman's period, and also for 7 days after that. So yeah, it's quite tough. And so depending on how strict the sect is, maybe sometimes people wouldn't even be able to pass objects to each other. Husband and wife may not be able to pass objects to each other. And there's always kind of like an argument. It's like, okay, well, can we pass babies to each other? Let's pass, it's safe. Now it's become safe. Okay, yes, let's pass babies to each other. But we have to check for, so there's sub arguments within, or it's like, is carrying something like considered work on the Sabbath? So there's all these like little things. Or it's like, if you carry your key on a necklace, is that like you're wearing the key, so it's okay? So you can walk to your friend's house, but have your house key and come back. So there's just all these like kind of arguments about little rules like that. But anyways,
Yeah. So birth control, I mean, do they even do family planning? Is that like super discouraged? Like you shouldn't even plan around ovulation or whatever.
So you're basically, I mean, be fruitful and multiply is a huge command. And like women in the strict Orthodox communities, they don't have religious obligations of going to synagogue or doing time-bound specific prayers. Their obligation is to have and raise the children. That's like the highest value. So it's interesting. I mean, so culturally, we'll be like, well, women are the most respected.
Yeah.
We are the religion that respects women the most because they give life. Women are so holy, you know, men are the ones who have to like go pray in synagogue a certain number of times a day. And, you know, but women have like this inherent holiness. And girls, when they're, you know, on Purim, which is the holiday you dress up, I mean, girls dress up as Esther, the hero of the story, or a bride. Like girls want to be a bride.
Gosh.
Like that is fantasy, a bride and a mom, you know?
Yeah, I'm laughing because it's so similar to Mormonism too. It's like motherhood is the highest calling. Yeah. And there were times when church leaders in the past said like, no, we don't do birth control. Like that's not for us. And God wants you to have as many children as possible. Like there are these little children spirits waiting in heaven to come down to good Mormon families. So it's your job to have as many of them come down through your line as you can, so they get born into a good Mormon family, right? And then in more recent years, it's been more like, okay, it's between the husband and wife and God and whatever they want. But we really don't want you to delay having kids. Like you shouldn't delay having kids in order to get a house. You shouldn't delay having kids in order to get an education or a job. Like just have faith in God and He'll provide. You know, and it's this like, you just take that leap of faith and it's okay if you don't have the finances for it. That's fine. God will provide, you know, He wants you to do this. So, yeah.
I've heard that one.
So that's fun. So, I mean, my husband and I, we waited 6 years before we had our first kid. So we were already rebellious and not following God's prophets. So, oh, well, I did appreciate that movie Unorthodox on Netflix. That I like the way that they depicted that, what that was like for them as a couple, and specifically how that was hard for her also. And I remember there's a scene where someone is saying something about you know, Orthodox Jewish women being baby factories, and she snaps at them like, I'm not a baby factory, you know, and how it's weird because I remember feeling that like inner conflict in myself. Like on the one hand, I'm supposed to be a baby factory, but on the other hand, like I don't want to be defined as a baby factory either. And so it was this weird juxtaposition of like motherhood is the highest and holiest calling. And so therefore women are like the holiest and the best and the most virtuous. But then at the same time, men held all the important callings, right? Men get to be prophets, men get to be bishops, men get to be counselors. They get to actually make all the decisions, right? And they get to be the ones who get to commune with God and bring His word down to the members, you know? So it was this weird, like having to hold both beliefs at the same time. And I mean, I think now I know why they said all that about women and mothers, and like, really, we're just like, we'll say anything to get the women to have as many babies as they can and stay home and build the kingdom of God by having more babies, telling them this is what God wants you to do, telling them will make you more likely to reach best heaven, you know, or, you know, this is just like exactly what God wants you to do. And each child that you get is a big blessing and you should be so happy for it, you know. You know, too, for women who don't feel like they actually enjoy it, or that they're cut out for it, that they're any good at it, or feel less than fulfilled in it. Like that's really contradictory. A lot of weird feelings of complex and contradictory feelings going on inside with that as well. Like I'm supposed to be doing God's work, and so I should feel so fulfilled. I should feel like communion with God doing this, you know, and all I can think of is like, gosh, I haven't had a good sleep in 20 years. So and I'm just yelling all the time because I can't possibly do anything differently or think straight because I'm so sleep deprived. And yeah, it's just it's so rough. And I think especially for women just decades ago in the church, where it was more popular to be like, no, we don't do birth control. You don't delay having kids. You have as many as possible. And then, someone would, and they would give their whole lives and their bodies and everything to the church. And then in an older age, find out it was all made up, or have a fake transition and not believe in the church anymore. Maybe believe in God or Jesus, but not necessarily the church or whatever. And then feel like, why did I just spend all those decades doing what I gave you everything. I gave you every bit of me, and I am tired in my bones. That was my whole life that I gave you. And it wasn't even true. It wasn't even real. I mean, it's just so heartbreaking. And so watching that part of the movie too, like really tugged at my heartstrings and made me feel so much for her, because I can so relate. Man, that I feel like is really, really insidious when you've got religious leaders telling you what to do with your family planning and telling you when to have kids and how many to have kids and how to have kids and then how to raise them. It's that gets me really, really bad. Yeah.
That I've definitely heard that sense of betrayal, kind of that feeling of betrayal, like especially when there's a feeling that leaders have knowingly lied or dissembled, where they're kind of saying, even just like the basic thing where it's like, yeah, anybody would count this within the community high school degree as just as equally good, if not better, because they know Jews are smart, as a high school diploma in the outside world. And that doesn't end up being true for like when they actually apply for employment. And then, so some of it, and even I think to this day, even people have left, sometimes are like, how much of it do the leaders at the tippy top, how much do they kind of know that they're sort of dissembling, right? Like the leaders at the very, very top, these middle-aged or older men, like they know birth control exists, right? And they're intentionally hiding things. So like at a certain sense, like they're definitely hiding some things, but then there are some things that are like, well, are they just telling me what they really believed was true? Or like to what extent? And then that also, it's like there's a sense of betrayal, but that's also like untangling, like sort of what happened to me. And I think there's also always that what if question, like what if my same self was like switched at birth with a secular family, and like what would my life have been like? And I think there's always that what if.
Yeah. We have that same kind of $1 million question. What do they know, and how much do they know, and how much of this is intentional gaslighting, and like intentionally deceiving us in order to get us to do what they want us to do. I'm of the camp that at the tippity top, like they know 100%, they know basically everything was made up, and they're not actually really, maybe they still believe they're communing with God. I don't know about that, but I know that they are, I'm of it. Camp in the attitude that they are knowingly gaslighting their members.
In that case, then would it be about like keeping power and control, or?
Yeah, I think so. And I think a lot of them genuinely think that the code of ethics is important enough, and they know that a religion is powerful enough to mobilize a group of people, right? And they can mobilize a group of people to do a lot of different things, a lot of really good things, a lot of bad things, a lot of useless things. But I think overall, a lot of people are of the mindset that at least we have this tight-knit community. And so people have that social structure, and it's teaching people a code of ethics that we think they should have. And so this narrative about the historicity of where church came from and the supernatural origins of it may be false, but the ends justify the means. So it's okay. I don't know. That's pure speculation on my part, though. That's probably what they're going through. Maybe power and control also, because they do get a lot of money. They get a big stipend. It's technically not a salary, it's a tax-free stipend. They get tons of benefits, really great health benefits for them, and their children and grandchildren, free education, plenty of travel expenses. And so there's a lot in it for them. And I believe too that some of them, once they get into those higher up callings, like they might have believed it going into it, but then once they get the higher up, they realize it, but then they're in too deep and they can't maintain their lifestyle outside of that. And then it would affect not only them, but their spouse, their children, their grandchildren, and even their great grandchildren, you know? And so I think for some of them, it would be too much to leave. Like we talked about leaving an in-group, leaving an insular group, it has to be really, really, really bad for you to want to leave or to have the courage and the gumption to be able to go. And I think
the cost is so high. Yeah.
Right. And I think for the people in the talk, we would say like the first presidency or the quorum of the 12 apostles or the quorum of the 70, those people, something in their life would have to be so bad before it would get them to say, okay, I'm out.
And it's interesting because that also sort of gets pointed to as an excuse sometimes, where they'll be like, well, just look, that person they left because they just had a really dysfunctional family. So that's just like their one family. And so they couldn't have had like a general problem. So you're, in a way, you're right, because maybe some people, who knows the number of people who are in like a super insular Orthodox community and they kind of are practicing on the outside, they're following the rules, they're doing it on the inside, they don't believe anymore, but it would just be too incredibly high because they love their parents. They don't want their parents to stop talking. Like there's pros and cons, and there's a lot about their life that they do like and that they wouldn't want to lose, but then maybe they don't really believe because they've gone out and read, you know, they've gone to the library, which like you're not supposed to do, or they've looked at the internet, which you're not supposed to do. They've read different things, which you're not supposed to do. By the way, I don't know if there's some type of equivalent in, okay, now you're making me feel like I can't say the word Mormon in the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints. Is there similar?
Say Mormon. It's fine. I say it.
Okay, sorry. I was just like, I'm remembering your shirt, like the Mormon girl shirt. I'm like, I thought it was cool for all these years. At least you told me. Okay, anyways. We
were supposed to call ourselves Mormon. We were told to.
Did the South Park guys ruin that the Book of Mormon musical? Yeah, now you can say whatever you want. I don't remember what I was talking about. I go off on all these silly tangents. I can't help myself. What was I talking about? Right. So in your religion that you grew up in, I'll say that, is there kind of an equivalent of, so there's this major concept in Judaism where it's like, there's this pressure to kind of almost like you owe your ancestors having a lot of Jewish children. And I think definitely like the specific event, which is like within living memory of the Holocaust, definitely contributes to that. Like I'm not even talking necessarily about like very, very Orthodox necessarily. I mean, I grew up hearing there are fewer Jews in the world now than pre-World War II. Wow. And like, it's our job to kind of replenish them. I was always under an incredible amount of pressure to like get married to a Jewish guy and make babies. I mean, my parents framed it as just like, look, we just really want grandchildren. Okay? Like, please just give us grandchildren. I think that might just be a Jewish cultural thing across sects. I mean, especially being kind of like a relatively small minority religion. And remember, Judaism doesn't go out of its way to try to get people to convert. I mean, people do convert to Judaism, but it's like you have to approach a rabbi, or like you have to approach Judaism, if you will.
Yeah, they don't exactly evangelize and go knocking door to door.
No, and if they did, they would only be trying to get less religious Jewish people to become more Jewish. And Chabad, which is a Hasidic organization, is like famous for doing this. So in certain cities, you know, you might have somebody who looks like they're dressed in Jewish apparel, religious Jewish apparel, like have something that they might be handing you, but they'll ask first, are you Jewish? And like, they would only hand it to you if you said yes.
Oh, interesting.
I would always get asked that a lot. I guess I look Jewish. I mean, they're like, aha, we found her. She's not wearing a skirt and she looks Jewish. Good, we'll hand this to her.
Perfect.
Like,
yeah, I mean, well, there's a lot of pressure to remain true to the faith of your ancestors, right? There's even this hymn that's sung like during worship services called True to the Faith. And it's true to the faith that our parents have cherished, True to the truth for which martyrs have perished, like, are we going to falter? No. And that's that kind of like indoctrination. It's meant for young people, right? It's a hymn about young people, like we're the rising generation and we're not going to let them down, So yeah, there's a bit of equivalence there. As far as like having lots of babies on behalf of ancestors, not so much. That's really interesting, that reference about needing to replenish. But no, for us, it's just like, you got to bring down those spirits in heaven that are waiting to get mortal bodies. So, it's, you can have them or someone else can have them.
Oh, the spirits are waiting. That's such a guilt trip. I feel like the spirits now would be looking down at me for heaven, like, hello, like, come on. Like, I want to.
Exactly what it is. Yeah, it's a guilt trip. And I can't tell you the amount of times that I've heard people say, oh, we thought we were done with number 4, but then we had a dream about this other kid that's waiting in heaven for us. And they're waiting for us to like get on board and have them. And so we decided to get pregnant again. I mean, that happens all the time.
Mm-hmm.
And it doesn't matter if the family can financially afford it, or if they have the emotional capacity to handle another child, or if their other children, have certain challenges that would make it even more difficult to have another one, I just mean like, some kids are easier than others. You know what I mean? Like, I have 3 of them. If I could just have like duplicates of one, I could have like 10 and be fine, because this person is so easy. You know what I mean? But different kids have different challenges. And I respect that some people have one and it's like, wow, that's a really challenging kid. I want to be done. But you don't get to have that excuse or that cop out, like you have to be like on death's door or be like, if I get pregnant again, I'll probably die.
Right.
But maybe I should anyway in order to give someone else life. It's that kind of decision, so much pressure. You have to have a really, really good excuse.
Right. I mean, so I don't know if it works like this in the religion you're raised in, but like I know in the more very orthodox sects, to make a major life decision, you would need a rabbi's permission first. So let's say, unfortunately, there's some very sad situation where a woman's life would be in danger if she got pregnant again, right? Like she would need to get specific permission from like the rabbi of her community to go on birth control, right? So what I find always so interesting and it is always so striking to me is like, maybe because I wasn't exactly raised in that society, I can't picture myself as an adult having to sort of run an extremely major life decision, whether it's buying a house or whether it's this or that or whatever. But like having to sort of ask the judgment of another adult first.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, maybe to some extent we do this with like doctors, right? But then like that could be different if you thought, I'm like, wait a minute, the doctor said something that doesn't sound right. You could get a second or third or fourth opinion or whatever.
Yeah.
But sort of like your head rabbi of your community, that's kind of like the buck stops there kind of. And just, that's always hard for me to imagine. And I haven't been inside that community. By the way, I'll mention like as a side note, it sounds like there's sort of a central authority in the Church of Latter-day Saints, whereas in Judaism, it's all just kind of, it's totally decentralized. But if you are like in this specific insular community and that's like the head rabbi of your specific community, I mean, that's it, like end of sentence.
Wow. Could you just like hop around to another one and be like, I don't like that.
So like modern Orthodox people totally do that. I mean, rabbi shopping, it's a little bit like a wink and a nod. They'll be like, I wonder if my rabbi would give me permission to, and then like the XYZ, and then like maybe I'll go to like the second closest rabbi if they don't. But that's maybe a little, sometimes people do that. It's weird. That's a little, I've heard that joked about with more sort of modern people, but like in those specific insular studies, you like wouldn't even go to the next town over, the next sect over.
Yeah.
I guess might even be just the neighborhood, the next neighborhood over, the next block over. You wouldn't really be able to do that because it's just everybody knows everybody. There's this like incredible pressure. I mean, I'll also sort of say, there was also a book called Hush. Mm-hmm. Her name, the name of the author is Judy Brown. It's interesting. So she wrote that book when she was in the community, and then it's also kind of fiction, but it's like based on some stuff that happened to her as a kid and some stuff that happened to some friends and some people she knew. Mm-hmm. So it's interesting because she kind of writes about both the good and the bad, because she didn't want to leave the community when she was writing this book, right? Mm-hmm. But the reaction to the book, unfortunately, caused her to like have to leave the community. So she originally wrote the book under a pen name. it is a huge cultural taboo to like air dirty laundry to the outside world. I wouldn't be surprised if some people thought I was doing that now. I do stand-up comedy on stage. I've said worse things. I've probably said worse things. I just hope I didn't say anything inaccurate. Sincerely, I do hope I didn't say anything unintentionally inaccurate. But like, yeah, there's a huge taboo against airing dirty laundry, especially to like non-Jewish, like people sort of not in the in-group. But yeah, if you're in one of those extremely strict communities, everybody knows everybody. Whereas maybe like a more modern Orthodox person could get away with it. And then, oh, by the way, she wrote another book. Why am I drawing a blank on what it's called? But Judy Brown, well, after she was out of the community, she just straight up wrote a memoir, which was also quite interesting. She's just a really excellent writer.
Well, and especially when you're in a group where people feel like they need to protect the good name of the group.
Oh, totally.
Then a lot of things are going to get swept under the rug. Same thing with Mormonism, same thing with any, especially high demand religion, an Orthodox religion, where people really feel like they need to defend the good name of the group. Then they're absolutely going to cover up things like that happen.
Yeah, and it's hard. There's also a taboo, and I think there might even be a specific rule about this. I don't quote me on this, where it's like there is sort of either a taboo against or sort of a rule within Judaism, like again, from like a very ancient rule. It's not going to like secular authorities about certain matters. Like don't report a Jew. Again, it's also kind of a little bit of cultural trauma around that, right? Don't like report a Jew to the outside police.
Makes sense.
Also, I wanted to point out Judy Brown's memoir is called This Is Not a Love Story, and it's also wonderful. It was sad to read that she was trying to both be true to situations that have happened, like to her friends when she was a kid, and speak well of the community. I remember in the book there were instances of like, if a family hits any financial difficulty, oh my gosh, you better believe the community will come to that rescue, not just with charity, not just like, here, I feel sorry for you, but like truly band together as a community and be like, we are all one big family. And without any type of, there's no, what do you call it? There's no like, oh, I'm above you because I'm giving you charity. It's just like, hey, I'm bringing you a casserole, we're all family. Like, it's this very warm, everybody knows everybody. You can see how that could be good or bad, right? Like, everybody knows everybody, right?
Yeah.
On the one hand, so it's like you would not fall through the cracks if you had a medical issue or if you hit a financial snag. Like, you wouldn't fall through the cracks, you just wouldn't. You'd be taken care of. So that can be lovely. Like, obviously, I mean, sometimes I feel a lack of it in my own life and I don't even know what to call it.
Yeah.
There's plenty of things, not just that keep people in the community. So I once read a blog, this was years ago now, I hope it's still up. It's so interesting. So a woman in one of these extremely insular communities I know of, this was, I think it was so long ago that they hadn't banned the internet yet. I think they banned the internet in some of those communities. They like just didn't acknowledge that it existed for a long time, but maybe in the late aughts, they like banned, they were like, okay, we finally have to like acknowledge internet exists. And then they had like a huge conference. I think they had men filling up, what was it? Was it Shea Stadium or Yankee Stadium? One of the big stadiums, they had men filling up the stadium and they had like a conference about it and they banned the internet. But they had like different groups. So sometimes it's like hard to get some of the different sects to work together. But they're like, we all need to, the internet is a threat to us all. So that was an interesting thing. But
that's sad.
Stop the tide of the internet. Well, so they can't have smartphones either. That's hard, right? Nowadays, anyways.
Yeah.
Unless you break the rules. She wrote a blog, and her whole point when she started writing the blog was to like show the outside world, just show an example, like, look, I'm just a normal person and I'm very religious. Like, you can be just like a perfectly nice, normal person and have just like a normal life and also be super religious. And she kind of, I guess, had felt bad. Like, she doesn't have much opportunity to interact with the people in the outside world, but she wants to show she's nice, normal, has a sense of humor. So she started writing the blog, but like in being on the internet, in reading other blogs from Hasidic and then sometimes ex-Hasidic people, you can like literally see her progression over the course of the blog, where she becomes less and less and less Orthodox, and then she actually leaves the community eventually. And then after she leaves, she revisits some of her old blog posts, and she was like, okay, here's what I was thinking when I wrote this. Here's what I was trying to prove. And here's what I have to say, my reflections on it now. So one of her blog posts was almost like explaining, why do Jewish people do? So she was in such a strict community. This is, by the way, not usual in most Jewish communities. This is not even what I'm about to say. It's not even typical in like most strict. This is like very few, like a very small number of communities. Married women shave their heads.
Also from the movie Unorthodox.
Right. I guess
they had to look up, like, why is this happening, and try to understand.
Yeah. I mean, it's hard to understand. I mean, I don't want to I'm not a religious scholar, but my understanding is just kind of like, if it's forbidden for married women to show their hair to somebody who's not their husband, what better way? What if there was an accident? What if your wig slipped? What if your hat slipped? There is no surer way than shaving your head, so you're the most pious.
Right.
If you shave your head, right? So if the rule is that no man but your husband can see your hair, well then, so if you shave your head, you've made it almost like impossible to break that rule, right?
Yeah.
But that's like a recent tradition. That's definitely a post-World War II tradition. And only in some very specific communities. By the way, in the book Hush, she writes a name of a sect that doesn't really exist because she's not trying to pin blame or whatever on like one sect. If there are issues in the communities, there are issues that are in common to all the communities. Like there's become like a bit of a taboo. Just to give one example of a controversy in very, very, very strict Orthodox circles, there's no rule saying that like a photo of a woman's face can't be published, right? There's no rule. But like, well, is it really modest to, no, maybe like a guy might not be comfortable looking at a woman because he's really trying to avoid any type of sin and temptation. So just to be safe, even if they don't believe that's an actual rule, some very strictly Orthodox publications, just to make sure they don't lose readers, don't include women's faces, right? Even if, let's say, there's a mention of a lecture by and for women of a woman's giving a speech. So it's like the men might have their names like with their photo, like here's the speaker, come to this event. But then the woman's will be like a picture of like a flower or a plant and have her name and like the description of the lecture, whatever. But then, so the issue isn't the type of modesty. The issue isn't in that case modesty of clothing, that the woman would be wearing modest clothes, but it's just like, is there something inherently immodest or about showing women? Or it's like, would it just be safer to just not show women? Like there's something making the rules farther and farther. And I think there was even a controversy that I remember years ago. This is when Hillary Clinton was Secretary of State. And I remember reading a news, and this had like hit like the mainstream press outside of the Jewish press, where they're like, in Orthodox publications, they like didn't include Hillary Clinton. They like photoshopped her out of a, do you know what I'm talking about?
I remember that now. Yeah, I remember being like, what is happening here? What is going on? Yeah, I did not understand.
Yeah. Right. And it's like modesty taken to a point of, and sort of, it's like the culture is really setting the stage for men to have like as little to no temptation as possible.
Yeah, which stinks. I mean, if women are supposed to be like the holiest, virtuous vessels, but men can't see them as that. Instead, they see them as a temptation.
And that's hard. And that's hard to just, I think that's tough to just be like, your corporeal form.
Yeah.
Even just your face in the most modest clothing, in a turtleneck with your hair covered. Like, yeah, your corporeal form is like inherently immodest. I think that's tough. That's tough. And it's interesting because a lot of you ask, like, if you polled the individual people in that community, they'll just be like, I don't care if a woman's like just her face is in the newspaper or a magazine, like they don't care. But it's kind of how it's like the culture's just be like, okay, we have to be very pious. And there's also a little bit of a thing where it's like, part of it is a reaction. It's like, well, you definitely don't want to be less pious than your neighbors. If anything, just to be safe, you want to be more and follow some extra rule, like just in case, but also to show a contrast with the outside world. And I think to heighten that contrast, anyways, if I can find it, I think the name was Spritza something, and I can send you the name of it. So as the blog goes on, she like writes her real name, I think, and then she talks about how she's did some kind of like master's thesis on this topic. Like, so it's so interesting to see her progression over the years.
How neat. That is so cool. Okay, so let's talk about growing up in a faith tradition and what you want to do for your child now. So let's talk about like post whatever parenting. What are your thoughts around like, so this is the way that your parents were raised and this is the way that you were raised. What about your daughter? What kind of things are you hoping to provide for her as far as like a faith tradition goes, or not? Thank you, Issa. Or not have her go through,
Right.
Yeah. So what are your thoughts on that?
It's something I think about a lot. And honestly, it's harder with the pandemic because for me, so much of what's beautiful about Judaism is the community aspect. And there's a certain cultural type of language like I said, before I explained, like acknowledging the anniversary of a close loved one who's passed away,
Oh,
and
right.
just all those millions of little cultural things where, just sort of being able to talk with other people who are
Mhm.
familiar with the culture, because sometimes the culture and the ritual and the religious aspects, there's not always a clear line between those things. Like,
Mhm.
if I light the Hanukkah candles and say a prayer every night, is it because I feel like I'm fulfilling a religious obligation, or is that my ritual and my custom, a tradition, and it means something to me? Like, it reminds me of great times with my family,
Yeah.
and it means something to me because I enjoy retelling that story with my daughter. I mean, so one basic thing that I love to do is, like, I love to get my child, books for all the holidays. There's
Uh-huh.
just like a lot of Jewish holidays, and again, just a lot of the things like that I do, I feel like in some ways are a reaction to being in the United States, which is a more Christian dominated society.
Mhm.
Um, and just sort of being like, well, maybe, they won't teach you in school. And I don't think I plan to send her to a religious school like Monday through Friday, but like, a lot of people, like when I was growing up, a lot of people that I knew who were Jewish, like, they sent their kids to religious school like Sundays and Tuesdays, right? So Sundays most of the day and Tuesdays after school, that type of thing.
Uh-huh.
I would love for her to have a bat mitzvah. I didn't have that. And then I got asked for years and years, oh, what was your Torah portion at your bat mitzvah? I was like, look at the time. I have an appointment. Like,
Cute.
oh. So, I definitely want to give her that option and have her feel supported. I mean, we were really, really lucky to just randomly 3 years ago stumble upon a Jewish community that's just very chill, very egalitarian. They sort of do services in both Hebrew and English. And we have chosen to do our holidays there. I mean, they're virtual, of course, with the pandemic,
Yeah.
but just, to have her understand various religions. She asked me during Hanukkah, what does it mean to be Jewish? And I'm like, that's a great question. I'm like, how do I tell a 4-year-old what it means to be Jewish?
Yeah.
Stalling for time. I don't even remember exactly what I said. Because every time you say a new word, you have to explain what that means, right? You have to explain what a religion is. You have to explain, but it's with Judaism, it's a little different. It's also kind of like an ethnicity and a culture.
Yes. Yeah.
There's like thousands of years of history, and there's
Right.
kind of shared cultural trauma, which I think virtually every single Jewish person I know, no matter what stream of Judaism or background they came from, even if it's secular, I don't think there's anyone who doesn't have some anti-Semitic incidents that have happened to them in their life.
Mm-hmm.
And I certainly have. Just knowing, sort of preparing my daughter that someday she might experience that. Some cultural rituals, they mean so much to me because they remind me of family. Even I have such positive memories, when we were going to the egalitarian conservative synagogue, sitting between my mother and father, I just remember that so strongly. There weren't really too many situations where I would just be sitting like next to them for like hours at a time. We didn't go to the movies together as a family. My dad hated going to the movies. And that was the place where we did that. And I'm just like, we're all paying attention to the same thing. I don't know. It was just,
Yeah.
we like stood with the other families and like had cookies and juice after. Well, they would probably have cookies and wine, and I was having cookies and juice, right? Like just very positive feelings of those type of memories. Family meals for like these multiple days, getting together with extended family, because there's like more than one night. So you can get together like with your immediate family on one day and then your extended family on another day, and then just make a third day to have it with your super extended family and friends. All of those traditions I think are lovely, and I want to pass them along to her. I want her to feel like she kind of knows what her background is. My husband has a very different experience of growing up Jewish. When he came here when he was 10, they came as Jewish refugees because they were persecuted, or as he likes to say, they were prosecuted. And I'm like, sweetie, I think you mean persecuted. And he's like, whatever, English is my second language, give me a break. When he came here in the 90s, he had Jew written on his passport, which we hear today and we're like, that's weird. But they were able to come as refugees because they were persecuted. There were quotas, there were limits on like how many Jewish people could go to like university, or like how many Jewish people could be in like any type of high position. The way in the former Soviet Union jobs were given out, I mean, basically it limited you for life if your paperwork said Jew on it, right? Like in some ways, people be prejudiced against you. It's like the policeman could stop you on the street and ask for your papers at any time, and they could hassle you for being Jewish. They could,
Okay, so I have a question. If someone
Sure.
felt like that's just too much of a life for me, I don't want all that hassle. I just want to leave the faith and not be Jewish anymore. Could you do that? I mean,
In the
it
Soviet
feels like it's so much more than just a belief system, right?
So it's like an identity, it's an ethnicity. I mean, look, if you took a DNA test, it probably wouldn't say member of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints.
Right.
Take a DNA test, it says 99% Ashkenazi Jew and 1% other. And I'm like, what's the other? But the point is, my DNA test says Ashkenazi Jew. I think other just means they don't know. They don't know. They don't know everything. I probably shouldn't be saying this on the computer. I can hear my parents' voice in the head. They're like, why are you telling everyone you're Jewish? Here's a perfect example of the mixed messages I got growing up. I would get a Star of David necklace for like a Hanukkah present, and they'd be like, always wear it under your sweater because you should know you're Jewish, but you shouldn't like show it to everybody else because you don't want people to be prejudiced against you.
Wow.
Unless you're about to give like a really good tip, then like take it out, give the amazing tip, and then put it back on your shirt so that people will know not to stereotype Jews as being cheap, but only in like specific instances.
Only
and
when
it's like a lot of mixed messages. I'm serious.
That's very different. We were told to be like, you got to be proud to be Mormon. Part of it was because we were supposed to be evangelizing all the time, you know, and like convincing everybody like, look, we're so good, you should be like us too and join our church and, you know, increase our membership.
Yeah, we had this like cultural, like, I think this is across Jewish streams and Jewish sects. There is a little bit of a cultural thing where it's like, look, everybody hates us, whether they say it out loud or not. Just keep your eyes out for another Holocaust because everybody hates us. Like, and there's just this like attitude.
Wow.
I know. I have so many mixed feelings. Like, literally, like we tell the stories, like the story of Passover, the story of Purim. Like, it's many of these, the story of Hanukkah. You know, these are all stories where like they tried to kill us, but they failed at. They tried to genocide us, and then they failed at genociding us. It's very complicated to be Jewish. And part of me, as I get older, I like appreciate certain rituals and traditions. I guess when I was younger, there was, you know, a part of me for a little while, I'm just like, oh, just kind of symbols and rituals. I don't really, there is something about humans. We like symbols, we like rituals, and there's reasons for that. And I always want to hold on to what my mom told me, which is like the golden rule is the most important thing. Be nice, kind, good person. Do unto others as you would want them to do unto you. Put yourself in other people's shoes. So yeah, definitely I hope to pass on that and some other traditions to my daughter. I hope she knows about various religions. It's a little complicated. Even if I said I wasn't Jewish, like other people would think of me as Jewish, right? Whether friend, such as somebody who's trying to get me to be more religious, or foe, somebody who would look at my DNA test and just hate me for existing. People are going to think of me as Jewish, whether I kind of label myself that or not. So I just, and I mean, I freaking look stereotypically Jewish. I look like Malayam Bialik, who's like well known to be Jewish. I did a face swap with her, and there was like no difference from the original.
What your identity as a Jewish person, right? And that it's not just a belief system. It's so rich with lots of parts of your culture and rituals, and how as human beings, like we crave that and we thrive on that, and we bond with other people over that, and we have these shared experiences with other people that make us more tight knit. And I think that's one of the things about tight knit religions and other communities that really bind people together. That even if there are some unhealthy practices, that we stay, you know, because it's still so tight knit. Even if maybe I don't believe it anymore, maybe I'm going to be physically in and mentally out, it's just so tight knit. And I know that we've got each other's backs.
Yes.
Should something go wrong. And part of that is because we have this shared belief system, or we have this shared rituals, or these shared traditions. You know, these are the things that we do together. You know, we sit with our families on the pew together, and we don't really get that in many other places, you know. And so that's such a beautiful thing that for me and for a lot of other post-Mormons is something to grieve the loss of, right? And to think like, oh, well, of course I'm not going to raise my kids in something that's a high demand religion and an unhealthy group. I'm not going to raise them in that, but I'm also at the same time sad that they're going to miss out on some great things that I have as like fond memories.
It sounds like part of what you're talking about is a little bit like a shared cultural point of reference
Yeah, yeah, that's huge too. And part of it is solved when you get to join ex-Mormon support groups, because
Right.
now we all have the same cultural point of reference. We know the same songs and the same traditions and rituals, and we get to reclaim them, and we get to make fun of them, and we get to have the same jokes and humor.
Yeah.
And that's really bonding too. And so in that sense, my husband and I have this good community. Our kids don't.
Be like Exmo, the next generation.
I'm so excited for you and your husband and your daughter, and you get to continue this legacy. And it sounds like you get just like the best of both worlds, right? Like you don't have to be in an insular group, right? But you still get to participate in the rituals that are so meaningful and so bonding, and so special. So I love that you get to do that, and hopefully she'll get to have some kind of tight-knit group also, that will have each other's backs.
I mean, I was so pleased. Like, I've only been part of this Jewish religious community for like 3 years. You know, I recently had a family tragedy where a very close relative passed away, and I was shocked. They've only known me for 3 years. They treated me like family. Like, everyone like sent me food and condolences, and they came to her, virtual burial, and it was just, I was overwhelmed by the love and support, and they all sent like condolence cards and condolence emails and texts, and I was just like, wow, like I feel so much love from this community. They've only known me 3 years, and they were like, we are your family. It was just very sweet. And we've been going to all of the religious services there, and they've even invited me to take part, in Holocaust memorial services and different things like that. They just welcome me in fully, and they were like, so how can we get you to participate in services in a way you feel comfortable? And it was just like very beautiful that they were like, do you want to do a reading in English or Hebrew? It's totally up to you. Like, and they're just so inclusive in a way that like I've never experienced. So I was so lucky. Me and my husband and my daughter were just kind of really finding our own path, because like I said, my husband growing up, so in the Soviet Union, where it's where he was born, you weren't allowed to practice religion. So to him, being Jewish didn't mean Hanukkah and Passover and Purim and all these different holidays. That's not what it meant to him. It meant, can you trust somebody to not be anti-Semitic against you? I don't want to speak for my husband, but it just sounded like it was a lot more about identity. It's like there's something written on my documents that, when he starts his first day of school, like the teacher is going to see, like on a list of the names of the kids, what ethnicity he is, which they would put Jewish on all of his documents, and just like, okay, well, is this new person I meet, is this person going to be anti-Semitic? If like, am I going to get hassled for being Jewish? If a new friend or neighbor or whatever finds out that I'm Jewish, are they going to be mean to me? And I think it's just like this kind of, it was more like this identity. It's like, oh, this could get you in trouble maybe. It's like a secret identity, or you couldn't keep it really secret, right? Because it's on all your papers. But so
talk about anxiety for a little kid.
Yeah, totally. So I guess when he was really little, he had a new friend, and he was walking to school with him, and the kid asked something like, do you ever go to church? And my husband was just like, sometimes. And then the kid kind of poked and pressed further, and then my husband, he admitted, he's like, I'm Jewish. And apparently his friend, he said he'll never forget the expression on his friend's face. It was just like shocked and horrified, like, you, like a Jew? Like, he was just like, oh, very shocked. I don't know what happened after that, but just being a little kid and having to worry about that.
Gosh.
Yeah, it's interesting. It just means something different to my husband. But so he and his family, I've totally got them on board with all of the holidays and like
Yay.
The Hanukkah. It's fun, all of the holidays. Purim is fun. It's like Halloween twice a year.
Right, yeah. When is Purim? I can't remember.
So because it's a lunar calendar, it's a different date every year, but it's usually in the spring, usually in April.
Gotcha.
Maybe March. I don't know. It just, is there a leap month this year in the lunar calendar? I don't know. And I did not just make up leap month to be funny. That's a real thing. That's why I never know when holidays are. Hanukkah was on Thanksgiving a few years ago.
I don't remember that.
It was like 3 years ago.
Like,
this is like November 26th. I didn't even buy Hanukkah presents yet. I was very confused.
that does seem kind of sneaky too, because I mean, other like non-Jewish people are only going to acknowledge Hanukkah around Christmas time anyway. Right. Exactly. So it'll happen already way long over, and all the Christians are all, oh, and happy Hanukkah to you.
My mom always told me, like, she's like, you know what, if people mean well, just say thank you. Like when people say, like, if they're holding open the door for me on December 24th, and they're like, Merry Christmas. And I'm like, you too. Cause I'm like, you know what? That person meant well. You know what I mean? Like,
That's so nice.
I'll save my being offended for actual anti-Semitism, of which there's plenty,
Oh gosh.
I'm still.
Your mom is so cool. Your mom and dad.
Oh, thank you. They're pretty cool. Like, about me making fun of them in stand-up comedy. But, yeah, no, I'm still mad at that girl from middle school when I was in sleepaway camp. And she was my friend for like 3 days. And then she was like, oh, what do you do at Christmas time? Because, we're getting to know your questions. I was like, oh, we don't celebrate Christmas. She's like, what are you talking about? I'm like, oh, we celebrate Hanukkah. And she was just like, oh. And then even though we had been like super close friends for 3 days, like we were buddies during swimming. You had to go to the bathroom with a buddy, I guess, so a bear wouldn't eat you or something. We were like bathroom buddy. We were like inseparable for 3 days. And then she like literally cut contact and stopped talking with me. I'm like, okay, that's weird. Like,
where does this
I
even
was so
come
naive.
from?
I was like 12. Okay, wait. So a day or two later, I confront her. I'm just like, hey, what? We were just we like hung out all the time. And what did I do? Like, what did I do? And she was just like, kind of like, oh, it's just that my family, wouldn't want me to hang out with one of the type of people who killed Jesus. So she literally said that. Yes, we were like 12. Yeah. I mean, it's interesting. It's like I can maybe be like, I'm lucky, I guess, to only have like a dozen of like stories like that throughout my life. And
only a dozen?
Like, yeah, my dad would be like, it could be worse. He'd be like, nobody's luckier than, no Jews are luckier than Jews who live today. And I'm like, I guess, I guess it's better than living 1,000 years. I don't know. I guess we have more stuff than we did 1,000 years ago and maybe less anti-Semitism. I don't know. But because growing up, I'd hear much worse from my parents. So like my mom's cousins of her generation, I remember she told me like one of them, I guess he had moved, I think it was to Tennessee or somewhere. And she said he was constantly being asked questions because he wasn't shy about telling people he was Jewish. And apparently one person said to him, but you can't be Jewish. And he's like, well, why not? And he was like, well, where are your horns?
No.
And this was like in the 60s or 70s. So you never know what people think. But
that's so ridiculous.
Yeah.
It's funny. Mormons have such a persecution complex. I mean, Mormons were persecuted out of Missouri, and that's why they had to travel west and go all the way and settle Utah. But it's like literally the only time you've ever been persecuted. It's just like a narrow viewpoint that like, oh, we had this one thing that happened one time. I mean, church leaders feed into it all the time. Like that we're so persecuted, or the time is coming, when we will be so persecuted. And so we have to like really bond together, and it's just a way of getting people to feel like they need each other more, and like they need to rely on each other more, and they need to be more insular.
Well, having like an outside enemy makes you feel closer to each other when you're in the inside group, right?
Exactly. Yeah. But really it's completely unfounded, and I have not had like, I can't even think of like a single time in my life that I really felt like hurt, that I was treated differently because I was Mormon, and I was outspoken about it too. Everybody knew I was. There was like no way anybody I ever met did not know that I was Mormon, right? I was very clear about that with everybody.
Well, I mean, you going around being sort of an ambassador, being as like kind and caring, you were a great ambassador.
Well, thank you.
And even I remember like when I was in college, I think people were like maybe making fun of Mitt Romney or something and be like, oh, all Mormons XYZ. And I thought like, I have a friend who's Mormon. I'm just like, hey, you can't generalize about Mormon. Like, come on, and I would like stick up for, I can't believe I was sticking up for Mitt Romney. He wasn't a candidate. But like the point is, if people are going to criticize him, it shouldn't be for something like they shouldn't be like, oh, he probably has 2 wives or something. I'm like, actually, the LDS Church, they have, banned polygamy like well before any of our lifetimes. I'm like,
oh my gosh, you are the coolest.
I'm like trying to tell them, like, because I'm just like, hey, you can't just generalize about people, or like if you're going to complain about someone like a candidate, like have it be for something they really did or didn't do, right? So like, and don't just randomly make fun based on stereotypes.
Well, if a Jewish person is going to have a persecution complex, I'd say like, that's legit. That's valid.
Fair enough.
But for Mormons to have this persecution complex, not so much.
My dad's gonna feel so validated if he listens to this whole thing and then gets to the end of it. He's like, yes, I have permission to have a persecution complex.
Oh, I mean, honestly.
By the way, I watched, before I forget, okay, so remember I said sometimes people come and do like maybe one-off lectures at this organization I volunteer with? Okay,
Yeah.
so one time, even though I was also an English tutor, I remember Logic 100 was like one of my favorite classes from college. So I learned all of the logical fallacies around that time. And I'm like, oh, cool, a name for things. So I remember I gave a presentation at this event, and lots of people came to the event, like members who I wouldn't have ordinarily met because they weren't people who needed English tutoring. And they came in afterwards, they were like, oh my gosh, like I saw so many examples of like each of the fallacies you mentioned in my everyday life. They're like, what? I didn't know. They're all, and like a lot of people are just like, oh, this is cool. I'm going to go home and Google all of these logical fallacies. So anyways, I wish I had known more, because this was like years ago when I first started volunteering there. I wish I had like known more examples to give. Anyways, totally, it might be like a fun video blog post idea if you go over the biggest logical fallacies. And I think this is actually something you've mentioned before, maybe like circular reasoning. I feel like I've heard you mention these type of things maybe a little bit in your videos, right?
Yeah, it could be. Yeah, I've mentioned a few things briefly. Yeah.
But it might be,
but I haven't done like a whole video just on logical fallacies and stuff like that. That'd be really
interesting. Because sometimes when people put a name to something, so if you just have this like intense feeling of like guilt, or you're like, oh, maybe that person was right about this, and maybe I haven't quite resolved that in my mind. But then to have like a name for the strategy that they were using on you.
Yeah.
And then knowing like there's some smart philosophers and logicians out there who like think that's a fallacy, because, you know, there's something empowering about that, I feel like.
Absolutely. Yeah, definitely.
Sorry for the abrupt ending. At that point in the conversation, we'd both been up way past our bedtimes and started talking about how really, really tired we were. So we wrapped it up and said goodnight. I hope this has been really fun and informative for you. I hope you had as good a time as I did. Remember to like and subscribe and hit the notification bell so you'll be first to know when new videos have come up. Thank you all so much for staying with me too. As you might have noticed, it's been a little while since I posted some content here. I have been having some issues with my feet and stress fractures, and it takes a lot of work to set up and take down all of my equipment. So I'm not quite there yet as far as healing and where I should be by now, but I'm hoping that within the next few months I can get back on my feet more, because I have a huge binder full of ideas and things that I really want to talk about here. So stay in touch, hit that notification bell so you can see when things come out, and I'll talk to you later. Good night.